This is Comic Geek Speak episode 1699, Spotlight on SHAZAM in the Atomic Age.
Laser beams, opinions like the seasons on everything you read in comics, movies, games, toys, artists, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek, uniting the world's mightiest heroes. This is...
I'm Adam Murdo.
And I'm Chris Eberly.
Welcome to the show, folks out there in Radioland. Here's Adam Murdo, your head lecturer for this last in a series of looks at the adventures of Captain Marvel and his Marvel family in the comics of Fawcett Publications in their heyday of the 1940s and 50s. And with me along for the ride on this final installment is adjunct professor and co-lecturer Chris Eberly. How are you doing tonight, Chris?
Brother, I'm splendid, especially since I'm doing this with you. I've been looking forward to this for some time. And like I said out there, I'm honored to be your adjutant in this. Looking forward to it immensely.
Oh, your help will be much needed, Chris, as we move forward here into this last heady era of the last years of this once heady era, I suppose I should say, sadly, of the golden age run of Captain Marvel and the Marvel family from Fawcett.
Indeed.
Yep, this episode will cover the last few years of that run, to wit 1950 through 1953, from the beginning of the Fabulous Fifties through that sad day when Fawcett Publications finally decided to throw in the towel and close down their comic books publishing arm entirely, allowing the Marvel family and all their costumed friends and supporting cast to slip into limbo for 2 whole decades. All right, and I don't want to waste any time at all here, so we're proceeding with the speed of Mercury to get right into these last 4 years' worth of comics here. These years do constitute the kind of the decline and fall of the Fawcett publishing empire. Although Fawcett did continue to exist after they stopped publishing comics, they did magazines primarily, all the way up through the latter 70s when they sold their Operation Lock, Stock, and Barrel to the parent company of CBS, I believe. But it was the end of their comics publishing, and we will notice as we go along here that there were certain concessions made by the editorial and creative staffs of the Captain Marvel comics and other Fawcett comics to the changing times. Captain Marvel never strayed too far from his classic formula. I mean, C.C. Beck, classically crusty curmudgeon that he's always been, would not allow anything less than that. But we'll be able to see as we go that Fawcett dips a little bit too far into certain prevailing trends of the 50s in comic books and broader culture than would be allowed under their once sterling standards. The heading at the beginning of all Fawcett comics always used to read, and continue to till the end, in fact, approved reading, wholesome entertainment. They did a better job of living up to that than some of their fellow publishers at the time, but even so, we will see. All right. So
Murd, I can actually start with a question, my friend.
I would be happy if you did, Chris.
Splendid. Just as we open the discussion, I just wanted to get an economic context. Is Captain Marvel still selling like gangbusters at this point, or is it starting to trail off already?
Yeah, there has been a long, slow decline in evidence by the beginning of the 50s, Chris. I mean, apparently the Captain Marvel line of comics were still making money and continue to show at least a modest profit all the way up to the end. But as we begin our narrative here at the beginning of 1950, we are exactly 4 years past the absolute peak of the sales strength of the Fawcett comics and the Captain Marvel comics in particular. The best-selling issue in the history of Fawcett Publications was Captain Marvel Adventures number 51, which was published January of 1946. And that was 1,384,000 reported copies.
Oh, my God. It's just unimaginable today.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Wasn't even anything really special about that issue. It just... Yeah. Happened to be the peak of their circulation. So, yep. And it was sort of a long, slow, gradual trail off from that point on. And of course, Fawcett wasn't the only one to see a decline in sales of their comics, in particular superhero comics. But it was enough to slowly discourage the powers that be at Fawcett and lead them. It made it easier to make the decision they made at the end of 1953. So thank you for that, Chris. I'd almost forgotten
Of course.
to mention that their fortunes had fallen quite that far. But things are still looking rosy at the beginning of the 1950s. And the first Captain Marvel story of that decade was Captain Marvel Adventures number 104. And this is a kind of a standout story for me because it shows that Captain Marvel is not just your typical slug the bad guy and throw him in prison and forget about him kind of superhero. The lead story of this issue begins with Captain Marvel slugging a bad guy and throwing him in prison. But then we actually get to see what happens to that con afterwards. This crook's name was Bozo Smith, but unlike most of the bad guys... Yes, only in the golden age, eh?
Yep.
He actually thought better of his life of crime after taking Captain Marvel's fist to his jaw and decides while he's in the stir to reform and study astronomy. He actually earns a doctorate by mail. He becomes Professor Bozo Smith. And Captain Marvel, we learn, actually keeps tabs on him while he's in prison, and as I assume he does for just about all the crooks that he nabs, and sends along a present for him, a fancy telescope that he is able to use in his studies of the stars. And Bozo Smith is then able to pay Captain Marvel back eventually when he discovers through this telescope a mysterious extrastellar object on the edge of the Earth's solar system, large, the size of a small planet, but mostly hollow inside. And he deduces from his calculations that this thing is likely to be an egg for some massive extraterrestrial creature, and it's heading directly for Earth. Nobody at the prison is willing to believe him. They all think he's nuts. But when he calls for Captain Marvel and he uses the wisdom of Solomon to double-check Smith's calculations, he actually believes him enough to go out into space and investigate. And what follows is a titanic battle between Captain Marvel and the giant planet-eating space dragon that hatches out of this planetoid, which is actually an egg, approaching Earth. And it's a really tough battle for Cap, since this thing is larger than the planet Earth itself. And ultimately, the solution to the problem is Cap gathers up all the atomic rockets on Earth, and when they explode harmlessly on the beast's hide, he saves the largest of them and flies it down the dragon's throat personally. And we're treated to a lovely graphic image of the torn remains of the dragon's corpse floating there in space. Cap then shoves it into the sun and goes back to Earth to congratulate Professor Bozo Smith.
So Captain Marvel also ends smothers the Cold War in its crib right there as well.
Oh, would that it were so. But, they can always make more atomic rockets, can't they?
Indeed.
Yeah, we'll see more Cold War-related stories as we go ahead here. But I just thought this was a nice, positive start to the 50s for Captain Marvel, in that we show that he's a kinder, gentler superhero who cares about those crooks that he catches. Then, the next month, February 1950, Marvel Family number 44, a full-length story, which became more common as we move into the 50s here, and the page counts in Fawcett's comics gradually shrunk until they were just the length of the average 32-page comic that we see on shelves today. But this full-length story was called The Rust That Menaced the World. And the entire Marvel family, Captain Marvel Jr., and Mary Marvel, have to contend with a living rust imported to Earth by a space mission to Mars, and then released onto the Earth by an unscrupulous assistant to the head scientist of this Mars mission, who has gambling debts that he owes to a local mobster. So he tries to pay them off by delivering to the mobster this alien rust that the mobsters could then use as a weapon against his enemies, I guess. The rust gets out, of course, and it immediately begins consuming all matter it comes across. Wood, metal, concrete, even human flesh. So all across the city, skyscrapers begin tumbling. And the Marvels, of course, prevail against this. They discover the one token substance that the rust cannot affect, which I think is glass, and they bottle it up and send it back to Mars. But before that happens, this issue's notable because the Marvels, in their human forms, are caught beneath a skyscraper that collapses on them, thanks to the rust's effects. And they're all injured pretty badly. So they say their magic words, and they become their completely unscathed Marvel identities. At the end of the story, they're really trepidatious about saying the magic words again and becoming human again. But when they do, they find that their human selves have been restored to perfect health. So we learn a new wrinkle to the Captain Marvel's powers. The magic SHAZAM lightning heals injuries. So, interesting innovation, but it does detract a little bit further from the drama of the stories, knowing that anything that happens to Billy, Mary, or Freddy can instantly be undone just by switching to their other identities and then switching back again. Now, this next comic I'm going to talk about, Captain Marvel Adventures number 106, March 1950. Interesting little story here. The Town That Never Heard of Crime. Now, they're playing with a bit of meta commentary here because as of 1950, of course, comic books had already been coming under fire for some time by certain concerned parties, such as Dr. Frederick Wortham, as to their display of violence and gore and other socially, at the time, questionable activities. So there had been talk of their coming under censorship. Of course, this is before the days of the Comics Code Authority when that actually came to pass. So The Town That Never Heard of Crime is a story that was written by persons unknown, most likely Otto Binder, because, as we've said before, Otto Binder was the writer of 57% of all the Marvel and Marvel family-related stories Fawcett published in the 40s and 50s. So there's a better-than-average chance that any given Marvel or Captain Marvel or Marvel family story was written by him. But it's sort of his answer to these calls for censorship. It involves a criminal named Hugger Jason, who is fleeing Captain Marvel's home city after attempting to assassinate its mayor. The opening scenes of the story are filled with examples of the heroic role of media, newspapers, newsreels, radio, and so forth, in lifting public awareness of criminals at large, such as Hugger Jason, so that they can then be reported to the authorities and brought to justice. So he steals an airplane and flies out to America's heartland. Cap follows in hot pursuit. The criminal parachutes down into a volcanic crater in the middle of the Great Plains of the United States, because there's so many volcanic craters out there, you know. And hidden in this particular crater is a strange little town that's been built there in total isolation from the outside world. When Captain Marvel goes in to try to apprehend this criminal, he learns that the peace-loving residents of this place, who look, roughly like I guess that era's idea of what Mennonites might look like. They have no idea what a criminal is, what crime is, what theft is. So when he says that he's there to apprehend this criminal, he just looks like some dangerous maniac in a funny red suit who's trying to punch an innocent man and drag him away. Eventually they go to see the elder of the village, whose name is Jonah Latham, and we learn that he, alone among all the residents of this village, knows what crime is, and we learn that he has sheltered his people from it totally for decades. And what's more, he refuses to allow Captain Marvel to take this criminal away because it might tip off his peace-loving citizenry as to what crime is and give them bad ideas. So the criminal is allowed to stay here in this little utopian commune, where he promises to behave himself and then promptly begins robbing everybody blind. And, of course, since nobody there knows what crime is, nobody has any idea what's happening to all their missing merchandise from their stores and businesses. And ultimately, the criminal comes and threatens the elder himself. When the elder, first the elder calls the criminal to him and says, "Look, I know what you're doing, stop it." Then the criminal says, "Oh yeah? Well, I'm going to pull this gun on you and lead you out of here. And since nobody in your precious little lily-white community knows what a gun is or what murder is, they won't know what I'm doing to you." So it's his little experiment is backfiring on him here. But then Captain Marvel arrives in the nick of time, bearing a film strip projector and a screen and a bunch of educational media to teach the citizens what crime actually is. And so the moral of the story is, let's see, I have a quote here from the text of the story itself. "We can't defeat evil simply by ignoring it. We've got to know what it's like so we can destroy it." So that
Murd, I had a question here.
Certainly.
So are they still not giving the creators any credit in the books in terms of the creative teams on these issues?
None whatsoever. It was hard
okay,
and
so
fast Fawcett Publications.
we only have historical guesses as to who was working on these books then.
Well, I think they did keep in-house records, but many of those records are lost to time.
Okay.
Yes, and of course, most of the people who actually created those stories are now no longer with us.
Although I'm sure people who are well-versed in Captain Marvel probably can identify artwork and things of that nature.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was just curious if there was a consistent creative team work on these issues, if we know that, or is it just a matter of whoever they had available at that moment.
Artists did tend to come and go, especially during the war years. But C.C. Beck was there. He was the artistic director, and he kind of helped to keep things uniform, occasionally even stepping in to redraw faces or panels at times, just to keep a consistent look to the Captain Marvel character and his cast. But yeah, I do think it's safe to assume that this story I just described to you was an Otto Binder piece. Binder was a big believer in the power of mass telecommunications. And so I believe that he's the one who penned this story, a warning about the dangers of censorship, even as it applies to violent superhero comics. As I mentioned in my notes, there's some similarity to M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, which would hit cinemas several decades later.
Yeah, I used to like Shyamalan films, but then I saw The Lady in the Water or whatever it was.
Yeah.
A movie I found so appallingly bad I started weeping with laughter in the theater. I lost control of my body.
Wow.
But well, you know, when the director of the movie puts himself in the movie as a character, says his creativity will change the world, I couldn't take it anymore. It's like, my God, they're wasting Paul Giamatti. Anyway, sorry, digression.
Yeah, I must agree, Chris. I haven't seen that movie, but it's hard to take anything seriously that makes a statement like that.
Yeah.
All right, Captain Marvel Adventures number 107 from April of 1950. Dr. Sivana takes over a small country in Europe, maybe Latveria of Earth S, who knows?
Huh!
But he has a hard time forming alliances with any other nations, which he only wants to do to lull them into a false sense of security so we can conquer them, of course. So, to make himself a more convincing diplomat, he takes a Jekyll and Hyde potion to bring his better self to the surface. Yeah, and he actually does have a better self, because if you look back to the very early Golden Age, to Sivana's origin story from Whiz Comics number 15, he was originally a benevolent scientist who turned wicked after, all the robber barons and wicked despots of the world refused his beneficial inventions because they threatened the human conditions from which these people were profiting. So he just kind of snapped and turned evil after that. But his good side comes back to the fore in Captain Marvel Adventures number 107. He actually tips Captain Marvel off to a couple of world-beating schemes that his evil side has. So it's kind of fun to see those that Jekyll and Hyde interplay for the world's wickedest scientist. And in a backup story to that same issue, TV station Whiz, the television sister station of radio station Whiz, where Billy Batson got his start as a cub reporter. After turning to television in February of 1946, they're now racing to be the first in the world to broadcast in color. Ever the innovators, those Whiz people. Although a little wrench is thrown into the works when a funny little man calling himself the Color Maker arrives to take their orders for colors for the broadcast. And Mr. Sterling Morris, owner of the station, kind of humors him for a bit. But eventually it turns out that he is actually the supernatural keeper of all colors. And he's got this whole little army of little elves and brownies and sprites that mix the colors for him. And before the end of the story, he becomes incensed at how his colors are being misused by modern artists of the era. And he withdraws all color from the world. And so there are actually a couple of pages of the story that ran in black and white.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so Captain Marvel has to go in and talk him down, and color returns, and Whiz makes its first color broadcast.
Now, Murd, let me ask you a question. So, having read and gone through a lot of these stories, is the caliber of the writing sort of like classic Golden Age fare, or do you find it a little more, for lack of a better term, sophisticated at this point? Is it changed, or is it pretty steady from the beginning all the way through when it comes to Captain Marvel's publishing history?
I would say that it's both more and less sophisticated than standard Golden Age fare.
Okay.
I mean, the subject matter is, to some people's eyes, a little bit childish, but the quality of the writing and the art, I think, must exceed what was being done by fairly inexpensive amateur talent at a lot of other publishing houses. And one more semi-interesting story from Captain Marvel Adventures number 107. It's not in the notes, but Captain Marvel engages in the world's mightiest battle with a character called the Space Hunter. He's a big game hunter from outer space who comes to Earth to hunt animals. And the interesting thing about this character is his design. He looks a little bit like Popeye the Sailor Man. He's got these huge, bulky biceps and kind of a squinty little expression on his face. And he gets his power from atomic food that he eats from cans. So not unlike Popeye's spinach. So this is kind of like what Captain Strong eventually was to Superman. Just got a little Popeye analog thrown in there to answer that age-old question of comic book reading children of the mid-20th century. Could Popeye beat up Superman? This might be C.C. Beck and Otto Binder and Company's way of answering the question, could Popeye beat up Captain Marvel? And the answer is, of course, no. Even though he eats every last can of atomic food he's got on his ship, Captain Marvel Well, he beats him ultimately by force-feeding him everything that he has left, and there's kind of an explosion. The funny thing is, Captain Marvel would have been perfectly willing to allow that explosion to kill him. It's just that the Space Hunter proved to be a little tougher than that. So, slipping a little bit out of character for Captain Marvel. But so, there you go. It's kind of like Captain Marvel's proxy bout with Popeye. Now, on or about May of 1950, Fawcett published a tie-in comic. We could file this under SHAZAM and other media for the Golden Age or Atomic Age. It was a one-shot comic called Captain Marvel and the Good Humor Man. And this was a promotional tie-in for a Columbia Pictures comedy film called The Good Humor Man, which was released to theaters, I think, in June of 1950. It starred veteran actor Jack Carson. It was directed by Lloyd Bacon, and it featured a young George Reeves a couple of years before he became Superman on the small screen in a supporting role. And it is actually a Captain Marvel-related movie, too. I mean, Captain Marvel doesn't actually appear in it, but it stars Jack Carson as a local neighborhood good humor ice cream salesman. He enjoys reading Captain Marvel comics. He's an honorary member of the local boys' chapter of the Captain Marvel Club. He's allowed into their clubhouse and everything. It's a privilege afforded very few adults. He's a little bit of a man-child, really. And his ice cream truck is stolen by criminals who want to use it for a heist. And in the process of trying to get it back, Jack Carson's character accidentally witnesses a murder, which puts the criminals on his tail. And he has to be bailed out of trouble by the boys from the Captain Marvel Club riding around on their bicycles, shouting their code word, Netpack Leverum, which is Captain Marvel spelled backwards. So, yeah, the big red cheese is kind of haunting the background of this movie. And so Fawcett was only too happy to publish this tie-in, the plot of which involves Billy Batson / Captain Marvel visiting the set of the Good Humor Man movie at the request of director Lloyd Bacon to give them some pointers. He's kind of the on-set consultant. And while he's there, wouldn't you know it, a bunch of real criminals decide to pull exactly the same stunt that the criminals in the movie pull. They steal the movie truck, the ice cream truck from the movie set and try to use it to pull a crime, and follows a comedy of errors in which Captain Marvel, with the help of the different actors from the film, try to take these criminals down. So it's one of the beyond the classic Republic serial featuring Captain Marvel, with which we're all very familiar by now.
Oh, yes.
That's another cinematic example of Captain Marvel popping up in the 40s and 50s. And Fawcett did their little tie-in thing to go with it. Now in June of 1950, Captain Marvel Adventures number 109. Here we begin to get a little deeper into that Cold War era content we mentioned earlier. There was a story in this issue, and it's fairly propagandistic in tone. You can tell because it begins and ends with an extreme close-up image of a man's hand pointing a finger straight out at the reader, and a caption that reads, "You, yes, you are now in danger." Not especially subtle. And the story itself involves an alien race that believes Earth has launched a devastating attack on them and that are now trying to retaliate. Captain Marvel manages to step in time to stop this retaliation, talks to these aliens, and they reveal to Cap that they have indeed been bombed by space cruisers with a big picture of Earth on the side of them. And Cap realizes that some foul play is going on here, so he tracks down some of these Earth-emblazoned ships, breaks into them, finds that the real aggressors are actually an alien race called the Claws, K-L-O-Z-Z, and they look very much like stereotypical, horrifically exaggerated Yellow Peril Asians. They're corpulent. They look like big piles of fat underneath knobby yellow skin, sharp fang-like teeth, long sharp claws, and do notice that their name, the Claws, is a homophone for CLAWS. And they wear uniforms that do sort of look like one would picture being seen on the communist uniform of either a Chinese or a Korean regime of the time. And apparently their plan is to instigate interstellar war between different alien races, such as Earth and this other alien race. And once the two planets have bombed themselves into obscurity, the Claws then step in to opportunistically ransack both the victim worlds. And their plan is to do this over and over again throughout the galaxy. Cap,
Murd, what month of the summer did this come out?
This would have been, cover dated June of 1950, so probably just before the United States officially became involved in the Korean conflict.
Yeah, because the Korean War broke out in June of 1950, so yeah, this would be right on the cusp of that.
And the indication is that whoever wrote this story, again, better than average odds, it was Otto Binder, was probably saying, watch out, don't allow any foreign powers to manipulate events and drag us into another destructive conflict. Yes, and which, of course, is more or less what happened. And then, Fawcett changed its tune about the Korean War pretty quickly, as we will see soon. But yeah, that's kind of a slightly more subtle and allegorical take on one writer's opinion of the state of affairs in 1950. That same month in Marvel Family number 48, the Marvel family go up against the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is also a fairly Cold War era theme. The Four Horsemen don't directly attack the Marvels, though. They just sort of hover on the periphery. Old Shazam warns the Marvel family that they're planning to attack the peace-loving citizens of Earth through greedy, corrupt human agents. And so fire, famine, and plague, three of the Four Horsemen, as presented here in this story, all choose human pawns with which to both attack the Marvel family and try to bring the world to ruin. And then once the Marvel family bring those three horsemen to heel, the fourth horseman, war, that word that nobody in 1950 wanted to hear, is also put to flight. So there's just something else that plays into the paranoia of the time. And then Captain Marvel Adventures number 110, July of 1950. Fairly patriotic theme for comic cover dated July. This is a 4-part full-length story called Captain Marvel and the American Century. With little help from his friend Mr. Talkie Tawny, the Talking Tiger, Captain Marvel stops Dr. Sivana from sabotaging a half-century fair, which is apparently something that was happening around the U.S. in 1950, and to stop him from then going back in time and manipulating history to turn the American century, as the 20th century was known in some quarters, into the Sivana century. So Captain Marvel dogs him through history, and their course through history includes time travel visits to a few carefully selected historical highlights from American history of the past 50 years, the years 1900 to 1949, including a speaking cameo by President Truman.
Now, Murd, when you say carefully selected, do you mean whitewashed?
A little of that, yes. And also just choosing those episodes from American history that seem, of the past 50 years, that seem most complimentary. You know, they're really not out to paint an accurate picture of what the United States was up to in those 50 years. It's just to produce a kid's comic book on the subject.
Well, of course. No, it's a complex, nuanced subject. I was just curious. We also should remind ourselves and listeners that it was just prior to these books, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in a test. And we can't understate the impact that had on the United States in terms of security concerns, in terms of a growing fear of communism and communist influence, the fact that now we were no longer the only big boy on the block who had an atomic weapon. All these factors were definitely playing into the sensibility of the time, and that also explains, like in this Captain Marvel Adventures 110, sort of that very American-centric, sort of chest-thumping sense of patriotism, because it's very much in the context of what's going on at that moment.
Trying to make themselves feel safe, secure, and strong by increased flag waving?
It's been known to happen before.
And it's been known to happen since.
Indeed.
All right, so jumping from the American century, let's see here. Whiz Comics number 125, September of 1950. This is a Captain Marvel story that divorces him from the earthly context entirely. Some mysterious supernatural phenomena are happening around the city, and there's some earthquakes, some tornadoes, and finally a giant chariot wheel falls from the sky and crashes into a city street. So that gets Cap to wondering maybe something's happening upstairs. And since he has an in with the Olympian gods, he flies up to Olympus itself to investigate what's going on. And there he finds his mentor and patron Shazam, and all of the Shazam gods. They formed up Olympic teams, and they're participating in the Olympic Games of the Gods against a group of evil deities led by Mars. And we're told that every 1,000 years, SHAZAM's team, the SHAZAMers, goes up against Mars's team, the Netherites, to determine who's going to have control over the mortal plane for the next 1,000 years. And the SHAZAMers are getting beaten pretty badly because the Netherites have been practicing pretty hard over the past millennium. But Captain Marvel then shows up as the ringer to help turn the tide in favor of good. Of course, Mars is one to cheat. So in the final contest, which was head-on-head, him versus Captain Marvel, he declares that it's unfair that Captain Marvel has the powers of all 6 gods on his side. Mars then utters the magic acronym Victman, which gives him all the powers of all of his teammates, which are Vulcan, a centaur. Don't ask me which one, it's just a centaur. Thor from the Norse pantheon, Mars himself, Ajax, and Neptune. And he suddenly grows to twice Captain Marvel's size. He becomes Captain Mars. But Cap is still able to defeat him in the final contest because, as Cap explains, the powers of war are strong, but the powers of peace are stronger. And he demonstrates just how much stronger peace is by punching Mars in the face.
Now, Murd, quick question, just out of curiosity. How do they portray Thor? Does he have red hair?
I don't remember what color hair he has, Chris, but I don't think it was blonde, so it could very well have been red.
All right, just curious.
Yep, I don't think it was red Norvell. It's just good old-fashioned pagan Thor, that's all.
Indeed.
And coming out that same month, Marvel Family number 51, we begin to see certain elements of horror creeping into the Marvel family of series. The Marvel family, into Fawcett's family of Captain Marvel-related titles is what I mean. So there's a story in this issue in which the Marvel family goes up against a trio of sleazy sorcerers, the Black Wizard, Madame Belladonna, and Hector the Dwarf, respectively. And they've got this little kidnapping racket going on where they've been kidnapping street people and turning them magically into stone statuettes and selling them as knickknacks. And they're just starting to get into the big time now. They're starting to kidnap people who come from higher strata of society than the orphans and homeless people they've been preying on to this point. And they're trying to ransom them in statue form back to their loved ones. And Freddie Freeman, as a newsboy on the street, is the first to catch wise to this. And so the Marvel family then goes into action and defeats them, of course. But it's just both in art and writing style, it's very different from just about all the other Captain Marvel and Marvel family stories of the Golden Age that I've read, and I've read all of them. So I'm not exactly sure who drew it. Pete Costanza is one possibility. He was C.C. Beck's longtime assistant and right-hand artist. But that's one theory as to who might have drawn this one. As for who wrote it, I can say with certainty it was not Otto Binder, because unique among most Marvel family stories of the 40s and 50s, there's actually some effort devoted to getting the Marvel family together to confront this threat. Usually Binder devotes exactly no time to introducing the Marvel family to the story. It's just Billy, Mary, and Freddie are walking down the street together one day, enjoying each other's company, when suddenly, and next thing you know, boom, we're just right into the plot from there. This writer actually takes into consideration that those 3 characters are not joined at the hip. They probably have individual lives, and if one of them catches on to something bad going on, that one member of the Marvel family would then have to track down the other 2 at their respective places of work, play, etc., and go from there. So it's a somewhat different and unique story in tone that appeared in Marvel Family number 51. And, interesting to note here, a story that almost certainly was written by Otto Binder. In the back pages of Marvel Family number 51, Captain Marvel visits a square planet. And yes, Otto Binder is the one who, 9.5 years later, would give the world the Bizarro world. So this is sort of like a tryout, I guess, for him. It's not inhabited by imperfect duplicates of the Marvel family or anything. It's actually just like an alien planet where Mendelian genetics apparently don't exist. No 2 beings look alike. No child resembles its parents in any way. And it's just inhabited by all these weird-looking creatures. And the one being on the planet that happens to look like a human is also the planet's most wanted criminal. So when Captain Marvel shows up at the square planet, because he resembles this criminal, he has a hard time getting anyone to believe him when he warns them that they're in imminent danger of an alien invasion. So it's kind of a proto-Bizarro world, which is a detail that's of interest to me as a big Bizarro fan.
Yeah, when I saw these notes, I was looking forward to you holding forth on this topic.
Me hope you not disappointed.
Me very disappointed. All right, go ahead.
Me unhappy. All right. Moving on to October of 1950. A couple of Marvel stories published by Fawcett this month are horror-related, and because it is October and Halloween's happening, you can sort of forgive them for it, but it's further sign of the ongoing creep of horror and its influence on the Fawcett line, and even the squeaky clean Marvel family. In the Captain Marvel story in Whiz Comics number 126, Captain Marvel meets the Friendly Horrors, who are a bunch of friendly ghosts, kindly and comical spooks, monsters, witches, etc., who escape from an enchanted urn. And we learn that they are actually the human residents of a small town who were cursed by an evil witch years ago. And if this magic urn falls into the wrong hands and a certain magic word is uttered, they will become the slaves of whoever utters that word. And, of course, a petty crook gets the urn and says the word, and these friendly horrors are pressed into his service and have to commit all kinds of crimes for him. But then Billy gets the urn away from him and learns that if an innocent young boy speaks a different magic word, all the friendly horrors will be freed from their curse and return to human form. And that's exactly what does happen, and the humanized friendly horrors then get a happy ending. They get to go inhabit an old ghost town somewhere on the outskirts of Captain Marvel's city and repopulate it, and that's so. There's a treat at the other side of the trick.
Murd, quick question. So, this is 1950, so EC is still going strong. Do you think that these stories are Fawcett's attempt to answer how popular the EC books were, even though they were far more mature than Captain Marvel comics?
Without a doubt. I don't think they're coming anywhere near the same sort of tone or the kind of sophistication that EC and its creators had to offer its readership.
Right.
I certainly don't want to make it sound like horror comics were dreck, because there were actually quite a few well-crafted stories coming out from EC at that
Hell
time.
yeah.
But the Captain Marvel version of horror is quite a bit watered down and lacking in the kind of tasteful irony that EC would occasionally offer. So it's basically just silliness. Very rarely do we get anything genuinely gory or disturbing out of these horror-tinted Marvel family stories.
Gotcha.
And another example of tame Fawcett horror, Marvel Family number 52, the Marvel Family closes down Ichabod Vort's School for Witches.
Huh?
And Ichabod Vort is an incompetent warlock who... no offense to present company, but who lives up to the old adage, if those who can do and those who can't teach. So he opens up his correspondence school for witchcraft, and all kinds of havoc is loosed, culminating in a baccalaureate on Bald Mountain when he summons forth a massive demonic being called Varko. It does hearken to Disney's Fantasia when a similar scene happens. You know, that giant winged and horned demon that appears as Night on Bald Mountain plays in the background. But the Marvel family are able to vanquish him and also close down Ichabod Vort's school. There's a very funny sequence near the beginning of the story where Captain Marvel is battling an enchanted broomstick. It's one of the rare times in the 40s and 50s when you see Captain Marvel really lose his temper. And this story is accredited to Bill Woolfolk, who is believed by some to be the second most prolific Captain Marvel and Marvel family writer of the 40s and 50s, next to Otto Binder. Let's see. In Whiz Comics number 128, this is the very end of 1950, Captain Marvel battles the United Criminals, which is a criminal analog to the United Nations.
Huh?
Now, the United Nations was only 5 years old at this point, so they were still a fairly hot concept. I mean, they were foremost in people's thoughts and imaginations. Otto Binder was very fond of them. He wrote plenty of stories riffing on the idea of the United Nations or employing it. And so he came up with his idea of what a criminal version of the UN would look like. Their motto, the UC is pledged to promote crime and outlaw the law. So Captain Marvel gets to go up against them and the various crime coups that they've planned around the world, none of which are really that imaginative. And Captain Marvel can take them and their leader, Mastermind Mike, down fairly easily. All right, that brings us into 1951, second of our final 4 years of Fawcett Comics. Captain Marvel Adventures number 116, a bizarre story, which doesn't really stand up to examination, but fun stories don't always have to. There's an evil genius who has he's developed a ray device, and of course, this is tantamount to magic. This is how they did it in both the 50s and pretty much in the 60s as well. Some kind of exotic radiation that stands in for magic whenever they need to have some kind of strange and otherwise inexplicable effect evinced upon a character.
That was Stan Lee's go-to plot device in the early Silver Age.
You bet it was. Gamma or otherwise. When in doubt, bombard it with radiation. And so this guy comes up with a ray device to his scheme is to uninvent a whole bunch of different modern conveniences, the automobile, the telephone, and so forth. And he does this by using these hypnotic rays to announce to the world, hey, I have just now uninvented the radio. And everyone goes, well, okay, these radios don't exist anymore. I guess I better put them out with the trash. I'll just content myself with reading the newspaper now because there's certainly no such thing as a radio, and there never has been. And then the uninventor will gather up all these discarded inventions, which he's uninvented, and take them to a parallel dimension, which is still in its medieval or feudal stage, and sell them to the populace as his own inventions, thereby amassing wealth and power in this other realm. Really strange plot, but of course, but imaginative. And Captain Marvel, of course, puts an end to it.
And what's this with Cap impersonating a genie?
Oh, yes. That's a backup story in Captain Marvel Adventures number 116. Cap encounters a good-hearted businessman who, despite his best efforts, ends up failing his investors and creditors with a business venture of his. And he's just so honest and so hardworking and so much invested in the Protestant work ethic. He vows to work like an animal day and night until he pays back all his creditors everything that he owes them. And he refuses Captain Marvel's help when he offers it. So Captain Marvel comes up with the idea of impersonating a genie, thinking that perhaps if this man acquires a magical genie who is forced to do his bidding and will help him to pay off his debts, he'll be more willing to accept that than just a handout from a superhuman in a red suit.
Of course.
So that's how Cap impersonated a genie. Now,
thanks, pal.
Anytime, my friend. Whiz Comics number 130. Now, this is one that I kind of wish Shane was here to hear about. Dr. Sivana realizes that he's come up with super scientific schemes to control the animal and plant kingdoms, but he hasn't done anything with rocks and minerals yet. So he constructs the king of the mineral kingdom, who is a robot that has the, I'm going to call it petrokinetic power to control all rocks, metals, etc. And the two of them were kind of a dynamite partnership until Captain Marvel turns their egos against them, of course. And they turns them against each other. And the reason I wish Shane were here was so I could tell him that the King of the Mineral Kingdom actually looks something like a power droid from Star Wars. He's just kind of like a big, bulky, old-fashioned air conditioning unit on two legs.
Well, considering George Lucas's love of comics, you never know.
And, we'll have occasion to talk about George Lucas's love of comics a little more shortly, actually.
Oh, terrific.
Let's see. Marvel Family number 59. This is another full-length story, and it's another possible allegory to the current geopolitical climate in the early going of the Cold War. The Marvel Family notice a lot of very strange things going on around the world. They find evidence of water flowing uphill, for example, of milk turning green all over the world, of flowers suddenly smelling like garlic. And when they investigate, they discover a trio of funny little men whose roles are somewhat akin to those of the ancient Greek fates. They dwell in a temple up on a high mountaintop, and the three of them are known collectively as the managers of Earth. And each one of them is in charge of a different state of matter that comprises the Earth, solid, liquid, or gas. And they get into this childish argument over which state of matter is most important to the well-being of the planet. And to prove their respective points, they've got this big cork board set up in their temple, and it's covered with little sheets of paper on which little basic facts of physical reality are scribbled, like milk equals white, water runs downhill. And if they take a lead pencil and scratch out white and write in green on the milk is white sheet, suddenly milk is green all over the world. And so that they're having this little competition to see whether solid, liquid, or gas is most important. And this competition gets out of hand fairly quickly. They're able to brush off the Marvels originally, but because they're powerful enough to turn them back into their human forms and then push them off the mountain. But eventually, this competition goes to the point where they're causing natural disasters, and they're in danger of destroying the planet with their silly little competition. So the Marvels finally manage to get through to them, but by then it's a little too late to stop what the managers of Earth have set in motion, or at least too late for the managers to stop it themselves. The Marvels succeed, of course. But the moral at the end is to tell us that the best way to run this is a quote, the best way to run the world is to work in friendly harmony. In fact, that's a lesson everybody on this Earth should learn. So just a little nod and a wink to the petty squabbles of the world powers at that time, and the dangers that they are posing to the planet we all must share by not being able to agree more readily. Let's see. Captain Marvel Adventures number 121. We see Dr. Sivana repeating himself, as unfortunately he often did in the 50s and in the 40s and 50s. He makes his third attempt to use time travel to go back in time and tinker with the origin of Captain Marvel. He's tried that 3 different times in the 40s and 50s. I'm guessing each story was produced by a different creative team because the outcome was different every time. The rules of time travel were different every time. This time, he very nearly convinces Captain Marvel that he is a benevolent scientist and Cap's friend shortly after Cap first got his powers and before he had his first run-in with Dr. Sivana in Whiz Comics number 2. But then suddenly, just as Cap is about to make a fatal mistake and actually help Sivana with a plot of his, Cap realizes, hey, wait, you called me Captain Marvel when you first saw me, and I just got these powers and nobody knew what my name was yet. How did you do that? And then, of course, he quickly tumbles to the fact that Sivana's evil, punches him so hard that he gets amnesia and forgets that this little time trip ever happens. Captain Marvel sends him back to the present and puts him back in his jail cell. And we leave Sivana in a tragic time loop as he's sitting there plotting to do again exactly the same thing that he did at the beginning of the story. So, yes, those who cannot remember history, etc., etc. Also in that issue, Captain Marvel locks horns with a genius locksmith known as the Unlocker, who challenges Captain Marvel to produce a lock that he cannot open. And Captain Marvel obliges by basically showing him a lock that's already unlocked. And obviously you can't unlock an unlocked lock. Ba-dum-bum. It's just good, silly fun.
It sure is.
Now, Marvel Family number 60. This is midway through 1950.
I'm reading what you wrote. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I thought you'd appreciate that, Chris. The Marvel family finds a lost tribe of cavemen living in isolation on an island someplace. They have no concept of currency exchange or capitalism. They do everything by barter. And they introduce to them the concept of money. And disprove in the process that money is the root of all evil. It is not money that's the root of all evil. It's the disproportionate lust, therefore, that is the root of all evil. And that's a pretty strong tentpole of the objectivist philosophy that Steve Ditko would ultimately espouse. And that's why I have in my notes here, Ditko would approve.
Indeed.
And it's also very much worth noting that this is the final issue of Marvel Family, number 60, that had backup stories containing Mary and Captain Marvel Jr. in solo action. It's strictly stories featuring Cap, Mary, and Jr. together after this point. It's as the page counts continue to dwindle. So this issue contains the last Mary Marvel solo story of the Golden and Atomic Ages. Because by this point, she no longer had her own ongoing series. That was canceled back in 1948. It was replaced with Monty Hale Western. And her run of solo stories in WoW Comics had ended a year before that. So this is the end of Mary Marvel in solo action. Whiz Comics number 135. Hard to resist this title. Captain Marvel Destroys the World! Not really, of course. He just creates the illusion of having done so to discourage an invading army of indestructible amoeba men.
The amoeba men.
Yes, the amoeba men. And nothing can destroy them. They do have one Achilles heel, but everything Cap originally tries to kill them is either completely ineffective or it splits them into 2 more amoeba men because they reproduce by mitosis, you see. But finally, Captain...
Now, dare I ask how they're rendered, Murd?
Well, I'll try to... They look like little round lumps of flesh. They have no heads. Their faces are right in the middle of their visceral mass. Their shoulders are attached at eye level. And gigantic noses, and most of them have mustaches. So they're just like a squat...
Oh, the mustache. Okay.
Yes, just like squat little pudgy creatures, but much hardier than they look. I'm pretty sure they were created by artist Kurt Schaffenberger. But when Captain Marvel can't think of any other way to destroy them, he hits on the idea of, hey, I'll destroy the world! And then he goes about pretending. He produces a very convincing simulation of his destroying the world, which sends the amoeba men into a panic, because even they can't survive the destruction of a planet. So they rush to their space cruisers and leave the planet, crashing into each other as they go. And all their space cruisers are wrecked in their... hurried attempted evacuation, and their bodies are scattered into the vacuum of deep space, which is the one thing we learn in the end that can actually kill them. So Captain Marvel doesn't actually kill these invaders, but he does trick them into causing their own deaths, which is...
Now, Murd, were there ever stories where Captain Marvel did take life?
There were one or two isolated incidents, but I don't think he ever took a human life. He's destroyed monsters. There was a race of Yeti-like beings that lived atop Mount Everest that he threw off the top of Mount Everest to save some mountain climbers. But yeah, he's innocent of spilling human blood. We can say that much.
Gotcha.
Let's see. Marvel Family number 62, Savannah, embarks on the first of several of Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor-like real estate schemes.
Otisburg! Sorry, go ahead. Otisburg!
Yes, I love it. So the first time he tries this, and he does do things like this a few more times before the 50s are over, he uses the teleportation ray to abduct several small American towns to the bottom of the ocean, and he exposes them to fish hormones. Now, this is 1951, after all, and before DNA and gene splicing and genetic engineering and all of that stuff had become well-established science, and certainly before they had entered the public awareness. So what Otto Binder tended to do when he needed something to happen in the plot that would be accomplished by genetic manipulation or DNA in modern science fiction, he would use hormones. That was apparently the hot concept in biological mutation back then. So these fish hormones turned the residents of these American cities that had been kidnapped into water breathers. They could not return to the surface world. And eventually, Savannah got the Marvel's human identities, Billy, Mary, and Freddie, into his clutches and did the same thing to them. But by the end of the story, they turned the tables on Savannah, expose him to the fish hormones, then they turn themselves into their Marvel identities and drag Savannah kicking and screaming above the waves and force him to cure all of the fish hormone-exposed humans and send them back to their rightful places in the United States. And that is the end of Savannah's undersea kingdom. And now, Captain Marvel Adventures number 125, cover dated October 1951. This is a key issue. This is one that would make anybody's list of highlights of Captain Marvel in the 40s or 50s. It's the first appearance of the last really major member of Captain Marvel's classic rogues gallery to appear before Fawcett went out of publication. And that character is King Kull the Beastman. He made his first appearance in Captain Marvel Adventures number 125. Now, his backstory, as is revealed to us in this issue, he was the king and ultimately the last survivor of an ancient race of, they're variously called sub-men or beast-men, which are these towering, hairy anthropoids, something like Neanderthals, but much bigger, meaner, and scarier. And they possessed advanced super scientific technology, even back in humankind's prehistory. And back in ancient times, they terrorized and dominated humanity. But eventually, humankind developed superior numbers. The beastmen began naturally dying out, and humankind was able to get the upper hand on them. But King Kull managed to survive. He escaped into a subterranean crypt, sealed himself up there with lots of his race's scientific equipment, used a special cryogenic gas to send him into a deep sleep for millennia on end. Although the memory of King Kull and his race remained sort of deeply buried in the collective unconscious of humankind, we are told in this story that King Kull and his race are the inspiration and basis for every boogeyman or beast or demon myth in human history. And then, in 1951, in Captain Marvel Adventures number 125, an earthquake awakens King Kull, and he immediately emerges to the surface world and swears vengeance, death, and destruction absolute upon the entire human race and the planet Earth. King Kull, we learn in this story and others that followed it, was a little bit suicidal. He didn't care if he died as long as he could bring about the death of humankind at the same time. That is the depth of his burning hatred. And it also... it gave writers a little bit more free rein with him as a villain, more so than there were stories that you could use King Kull for that you wouldn't necessarily be able to use Dr. Savannah for. So Captain Marvel acquired another good, reliable, and versatile foil in this story. And let me conclude this synopsis with a reproduction of King Kull's trademark laugh. Ha ho ha ho ha! You haven't made it in Captain Marvel's Rogues Gallery unless you have a trademark laugh. Dr. Savannah's was heh heh heh. And with King Kull, it's always some combinations of ha's and ho's, ending with a protracted ha, sounding like just a dangerous warlord. And indeed, he wore like a Viking helmet with a skull on the top and horns on either side. So just picture a giant, hairy caveman with a helmet like that who also wields super scientific weapons. It's kind of a humorous juxtaposition, the Neanderthalic appearance and the super scientific know-how. Jeff Parker played with that in a latter day, just within the past few years, Captain Marvel story that he wrote. Well, let's see. Another interesting thing about this issue, though, it was the first appearance of a minor backup character who made just a handful of appearances, but his name was Timmy Tinkle, the Mechanical Man. And he was an intelligent robot with a heart of gold. And it's significant in that, this is sort of a recurring theme for Otto Binder. Chris, I want to say you might actually have been the one that brought this to my attention during our last one of these spotlights, but it was actually Otto Binder and his brother Earl. The two of them wrote together occasionally under the pseudonym Eando Binder. They actually came up with the phrase "I, Robot," which was later borrowed by Isaac Asimov for his much better-known series of novels. But it was originally used as the title for a pulp story, science fiction being the first love of Otto Binder and his brother. Much as he loved superheroes, science fiction was his preferred genre. And the protagonist of the iRobot story, Adam Link, a robot who was struggling to learn autonomy and human values and qualities, was kind of an inspiration for a number of things in science fiction, really, but certainly for this Timmy Tinkle character that Otto Binder introduced to Captain Marvel's world. It's a much cleaner and less philosophically complex version of Adam Link, you might say. And he's introduced in this story. He shows up at the offices of Whiz Radio asking for a job. And then a series of mysterious robberies occur. And we learn that he's been programmed to steal by his inventor, whose name is Ivan de Rook. As in, I want to rook. Yes, you don't always need a scorecard to tell the players in a Golden Age Captain Marvel story. Pretty obvious he was the bad guy from the instant he appeared on panel. But the Captain Marvel is able to free Timmy Tinkle from the thrall of his wicked inventor, and he is then allowed to begin his life among human beings in earnest. As I said, he showed up a couple more times. This is a character that I kind of hope that somebody, maybe Grant Morrison, if he does any more Multiplicity Thunderworld type comics, might throw in as like a backup character in the background of a panel set at Whiz Radio, just as a reminder that, Captain Marvel for a little while there did have an intelligent robot as a supporting character at his workplace. That same month in Marvel Family number 64, first we had Whiz TV, then Whiz Color TV, and now Station Whiz, ever the Trailblazer, is all set to make the first ever global broadcast via its USA TV project. They build a mile-high aerial antenna, to broadcast to the, as we're told, only a few million people in the world who have the right kind of receiver to receive the broadcast that they're attempting. So, again, on the cutting edge of telecom technology, and, of course, Dr. Savannah, to generate a plot, tries to sabotage it. I think it's really just about Otto Binder wanting to, no pun intended, marvel at a lot of the technological achievements of the age in which he was writing. He wrote fairly positive science fiction when you come down to it. He brings a certain golly gee wow factor to a lot of the Captain Marvel stories he wrote in the 40s and 50s. It's just similar in tone to Walt Disney's Tomorrowland, shall we say. And
we have to remember that this early 50s, so at this point, a large number of American families starting to have televisions come into their homes. So you start to have that beginnings of that common television culture. So I'm sure he's plugging into that as well.
Right. And tapping into its possibilities for world harmony, maybe.
Indeed.
Let's see. Captain Marvel Adventures number 127 in December of 1951. Another side character. They were always introducing new supporting characters here and there in the pages of these various Marvel family stories. I'm really only making note of the ones that made repeat appearances. But this one did. His name was Doc Quartz, and he was a folksy old pharmacist who operates the drugstore in the Whiz radio, in the skyscraper that houses Whiz Radio. So that's where Billy Batson sometimes sends down for his lunch. And Doc Quartz, he has a long white beard and spectacles, and he is a self-proclaimed genius who dabbles in super scientific experiments that almost always go wrong. It's a hallmark of Golden Age Fawcett storytelling that they would often have various wacky scientists or absent-minded professors come in for one-off stories to introduce some scientific gadget that would be the springboard for a story. And so this is their attempt, short-lived though it was, at having kind of an in-house wacky scientist that could introduce these devices right there at Station Whiz on site. In his first appearance, he gives Mr. Sterling Morris a youth potion that causes him to comically de-age. Also in this story... It's a general truism or a convention of Captain Marvel stories of this era that nothing can harm or change or affect any member of the Marvel family in any way. But Dr. Savannah, leaving science behind temporarily and resorting to mysticism, makes a voodoo doll using some of Cap's hair and finds that even though he can't harm Cap with it or alter him in any way, he can at least move Cap's body around. And he uses the voodoo doll to force Cap into a volcano and then try to manipulate the voodoo doll to make Captain Marvel say Shazam, thus turning back into Billy in the middle of a volcano and burning to a crisp and dying. The joke is on Savannah, though, because Cap can't say Shazam when his mouth is full of hot lava. And then Cap flies out of the volcano and punches Savannah in the face. The end. Let's see. And kind of a fun feature-length story here from Marvel Family number 66, the same month. Mr. Sterling Morris suffers an apparent midlife crisis and... just sort of apropos of nothing, in the middle of a dinner party, he's invited Billy, Mary, and Freddie over to his house for dinner, and he tells them afterwards, "Oh, by the way, I've discovered this map to this mysterious artifact called a miracle stone in darkest Africa. I'm going to try to find it, and you're all coming with me." And so he distributes to these children safari jackets and pith helmets, and they all just randomly go off to Africa looking for this thing. So a jungle adventure ensues. They have to suffer the betrayal of a sinister guide whom they hire. There are African natives there who have pledged their lives to defending the Miracle Stone and preventing anyone from getting their hands on its power, because it's basically the Fawcett universe's version of a cosmic cube. You get it, and your every whim becomes reality. And so Mr. Morris gets it, goes a little bit mad with power, starts making all kinds of cockamamie changes to reality around him. We've got lions speaking French. We've got skies the color of fruit stripe gum. Mass hysteria. But finally, the Marvel family is able to get through to him, get the stone away from him. They give it to a tribal chieftain who says that for the good of all those involved, he would use the power of the stone to wish the Americans back to America, wiping out all memory they had of their adventure. And so that's everything just kind of goes full circle. But it's just kind of neat to me that there is an artifact like that in the Earth S reality. And I'm pretty sure no other writer ever tapped into that. So now we found our way to 1952. January of that year. Marvel Family number 67. Another full-length story. This is the second appearance of King Kull the Beastman, and already they're fiddling with his backstory. In his first appearance, we're told that he was in hibernatory sleep since ancient times. But in this story, we learn that actually he's woken himself up periodically throughout the last several millennia to creep out of his little crypt and menace humanity. And that's kind of how he gave rise to all those boogeyman legends over the years. 1952 was an Olympic year, and so possibly tapping into that, the writer of this story, again probably Otto Binder, reveals to us that there are 3 magic torches of democracy that SHAZAM has been charged with keeping safe, and that King Kull, of course, takes his first opportunity to extinguish. And then the Marvel family has to go on this romp through history, visiting the points in human history when those 3 torches were created and first lit. So, according to Binder, the 3 most important focal points of democracy in human history are ancient Greece, where they must relight the lamp of democracy, 1215 A.D., when King John signs the Magna Carta, where they can relight the flame of freedom. And then 1776, the future United States, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where they can relight the torch of liberty. It's all fairly symbolic and also somewhat jingoistic. And and of course, King Kull the Beastman is present. His past selves in each of these eras try to thwart the Marvel family, and he never succeeds. They manage to relight all these torches, and they go back to the present, and they participate in the Festival of Democracy Day, which I'm pretty sure is an invented civil holiday that Binder put into place, and which came this close to being renamed Dictator Day. Let's see. Whiz Comics.
Murd, actually, I had a question.
Sure.
So, they call the character King Kull. Now, Robert E. Howard's Kull. Is there any coincidence, or were they just co-opting the name, or what?
Well, I'm kind of ashamed that never occurred to me, but okay, let's see. Robert E. Howard. I'm taking a look here to see when he was created, and yeah, he first turned up in 1929. So there does seem to be a pretty strong possibility that that name was borrowed from Robert E. Howard's fiction.
Because I mean, obviously, he had first appeared as a pulp character. Then you'll see him in comics in Marvel from Marvel in the Bronze Age. Sorry, sir. Go ahead. Didn't mean to knock off your stride there.
Oh no, not at all, Chris. That's an excellent catch. I don't know why that never occurred to me before. It's probably because I'm not. I've never been much of a Robert E. Howard reader, but yeah, certainly I have heard of Kull the Conqueror. But yeah, I never made that connection. Well, so see, I'm as you always say to me, Chris. I'm glad you're here.
From you, my friend, those words are quite weighty. Thank you.
Let's see. Whiz Comics number 142 is the next of Savannah's real estate schemes. He builds a kingdom on elevated platform above the Rocky Mountains, and he doses American citizens with rebellion gas that makes them want to evacuate the United States and move to live under his iron rule. Even Billy Batson falls prey to that rebellion gas, but then I guess somehow he's convinced that it's in... Oh, I think he turns into Captain Marvel to get him to rebel against the United States as well, but of course Cap is unaffected, and he proceeds to beat the tar out of Savannah and thwart his scheme. That same month, Marvel Family number 68, a showdown between the Marvel family and the Savannah family. This is one of several times during the Golden and Atomic Ages when either Savannah or his family invade the Rock of Eternity and attempt to take the wizard SHAZAM himself captive. The first time this was attempted was in the landmark Captain Marvel Adventures number 100, which was... also a full-length thriller from September of 1949. This time, Savannah does the same thing, but with his whole family in tow. That story was called Captain Marvel Adventures was called The Plot Against the Universe. This story is called The Capture of the Universe. They get SHAZAM into a corner, and they manage to strip him of his robe, his mantle of magic, which in this story we're told is the secret to his immortality and invulnerability. In Captain Marvel Adventures number 100, he had a magic bracelet, but... details. So they steal the mantle, and he becomes vulnerable, and they're able to make the Marvel family dance to their tune at that point. But, of course, the Marvels manage to slip back into the Rock of Eternity and gain the upper hand. Captain Marvel Adventures number 130. Now, I mentioned that King Kull was a useful new villain to the writers of Captain Marvel at those times because of his differing motivations from Dr. Sivana. Well, in Captain Marvel Adventures number 130, these differing motivations actually bring those two characters into direct conflict with one another. And Cap must then contend with the double doom, that's what the story calls it, the double doom of a King Kull and Dr. Sivana feud. Captain Marvel and Sivana are in the middle of one of their standard confrontations when suddenly they notice that Cap appears to be growing at an alarming rate. And they know this can't be true because, as I pointed out a little bit ago, nothing is supposed to be able to harm or change any member of the Marvel family in any way. So they soon figure out that it's not Cap that's growing, it's the planet Earth that is shrinking. And going out to investigate, Cap soon discovers King Kull in an orbiting headquarters, training his dwindle ray on planet Earth and shrinking it down to the size of a peanut so that he can then crush it beneath his foot. And Sivana, of course, strongly objects to this because, here, again, these conflicting motivations. Dr. Sivana, he's motivated by egoistic desire for wealth, power, influence, and just to prove himself superior to all other human and intelligent life, to prove that he is, as he's always believed himself to be, the rightful ruler of the universe. Whereas King Kull doesn't want to conquer or rule anybody. He just wants to destroy humanity out of vengeance. So he's somewhat more reckless or ruthless, and he can scheme somewhat bigger because he doesn't need to worry as much about the consequences. Whereas Dr. Sivana has to conquer the Earth while preserving some people alive for him to rule. So the two of them end up going toe-to-toe, and in the middle of this clash of egos and cuss words, Cap is able to play both ends against the middle and defeat them both. But it's always kind of neat when you can see Golden Age villains quarreling amongst themselves. All right, here's a historical epic, Marvel Family number 70. The Marvel family visits Camelot. Mr. Sterling Morris digs out an old suit of armor from his ancestral home and puts it on as a prank to scare Billy, Mary, and Freddie. But then they discover a mysterious inscription on the breastplate that says that who wears this armor will be brought back to Camelot in its time of need, or words to that effect. And sure enough, the armor is magic. It turns out that Sterling Morris is a direct descendant of King Arthur, and he's transported back to Camelot in King Arthur's time to rescue Queen Guinevere and the realm of Camelot as a whole from the evil Black Wizard. And so the Marvel family use the Rock of Eternity to follow him back in time, and they help because Mr. Morris is not doing very well for himself. There's a sequence where they have to defeat a magic dragon that Black Wizard has sent against them, not once but 1,000 times. So they have to come up with one. Yes, it dies 1,000 deaths. So they have to come up with 1,000 different ways to kill this thing. Somewhat creative. And then by the end of it, they do rescue Queen Guinevere, but they decide that out of respect for his role as rightful ruler of the land as much as anything else, they decide that King Arthur should be present to vanquish the Black Wizard and his hordes. But King Arthur is out fighting the Crusades. So the Marvel family just shrug. They go down to the Holy Land, and to get King Arthur home again to deal with this, they end the Crusades in 2 panels. Again, only in the Golden Age. And as kind of the comedy ending, they capture the Black Wizard, and Mr. Morris rules that the perfect punishment for him would be to have to wear a suit of armor for the rest of his life, because the story is filled with gags of poor Mr. Morris, how uncomfortable these steel long johns have made him. Oh, poor Mr. Morris. He's kind of like the Perry White of Captain Marvel's world, but he's somewhat more vacuous and buffoonish than Perry is. He gets himself into all kinds of trouble. Somewhere between Perry White and Arthur Carlson of station WKRP, you will find Sterling Morris.
WKRP, wow.
Mm-hmm. Baby, if you...
Murd.
All right, now this brings us to Marvel Family number 71, May of 1952. And this is a somewhat interesting landmark in the late history of the Marvel family. Now, the story in this issue is called The Mystery of Ghost Island. It involves the Marvel family helping basically a Swiss Family Robinson, although they're American. They're a mild-mannered shoe salesman and his family that set out to sea after the father has a nervous breakdown from having to look at feet all day. And they find their way to this island on an old map written by Captain Cook himself that the shoe salesman somehow got his hands on. And they're trying to set up a new life for themselves on this island. And it's got all the resources they need, abundant natural sources of food. But the problem is it's super haunted. It's just crawling with all kinds of ghosts and demons and hags and werewolves. And the Marvel family, in their human identities, have been on a cruise nearby. They catch their SOS for help, and they go and they help to bust all the ghosts and allow the family to continue living their lives in idyllic peace. And they rename the island Marvel Island in their honor. But the real story here is not so much the plot of the story itself. This issue is the first appearance of the new-look Mary Marvel. Like her classic costume and character design, originally inspired by Judy Garland, is altered in this issue and remains so, more or less, for the rest of the 1950s run of these characters. So her dress was altered so that it had a lower neckline. It extended all the way down to the top of the yellow lightning bolt that all of the Marvel family bear as their standard. Her hairstyle was made shorter. So sort of a more mature look. And her yellow buccaneer boots were replaced by little Tinkerbell slippers. In addition to that, her, shall we say, natural assets are noticeably enhanced to give her, Mary Marvel, a somewhat older appearance. Also, her dress, her uniform dress is drawn as sleeveless in this issue, which I think was probably decided made her look a little bit too loose. So the sleeves were reinstated in future issues, but the altered neckline, hairstyle, and footwear would remain until the end of the Marvel family's run. So as far as why this was done, not entirely certain. Probably just for good girl appeal. Now, I'm referring to one of my primary sources for this series of spotlights, which is Tomorrow Publishing's excellent Fawcett Companion, which is a collection of some of the best interviews and articles published by the newsletter of the Fawcett Collectors of America throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there is an interview contained therein with Fawcett's longtime executive editor, Will Lieberson, who was more or less to the Fawcett line of comics back then what an editor-in-chief would be today. He was the one who had the final approval on just about every book that Fawcett published. But he was interviewed in 1975 and asked to justify the new-look Mary Marvel. And he gave this the following dubious and possibly slightly sexist answer. Perhaps Mary's mature change had something to do with her new editor. For a long time, Mary Marvel was edited by Mercy Shull, who could have fitted easily into a 32A bra. When Mercy left to open a dude ranch, she was replaced by Kay Woods, who would barely have fit into a 38C cup, and consequently, Mary's shape began to blossom. End quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a that's a time capsule.
For sure.
Yeah, that would obviously not pass muster with our modern sensibilities today.
Yeah, I mean, just in addition to how doubtful and also objectionable the idea that the character was changed because her new editor had bigger boobs might be, I just find it kind of curious that Mary Marvel would even have an editor assigned to curate that one character alone, because by then, there were no more solo Mary Marvel stories. She only appeared in the Marvel Family series, and Wendell Crowley, the editor Wendell Crowley, had that locked down. So I don't know why there even would have been an editor in charge of the appearance of that one character at that point. Even assuming that there's any validity whatsoever to Lieberson's claim that the cup size of the new editor precipitated the change in the character's appearance, I don't know why there would have been a new editor. So it's suspect on a couple of different levels.
Murd, I have a question. Do we know the demographic of the readership? Is it still young kids at this point? Primarily, right?
Primarily, and as we were on into the mid to later 50s and into the 60s, I think it was even more presumed that the readership would be young children. Now, hence the whole moral panic behind Frederick Wortham and his Seduction of the Innocent. But there were clearly some older readers as well, and perhaps they thought they were appealing to such customers by altering Mary Marvel's appearance like that. But as I said, they did backpedal from that a little bit. Mary's cup size did decrease a little bit, and as I said, they re-added the sleeves. So it should make her look a little bit less cheap.
Well, that antediluvian quote you read is just a brief glimpse into what so many women had to deal with in the workplace back then.
And now is as good a time as ever to mention, actually, that Fawcett actually did, Mr. Lieberson's jaundiced sentiment aside, Fawcett really did do their fair part in employing a greater than average number of women as editors in the Golden Age. As a matter of fact, during this period we're examining, 1950 through 53, Whiz Comics, at one time Fawcett's flagship title and the birthplace of Captain Marvel, was edited exclusively by female editors. First the aforementioned Mercy Shull, and later by Virginia Ginny Proviziero.
And that's very unusual, yeah.
Yep. And in my research, mostly, again, in tomorrow's Fawcett Companion, I dug up the names of roughly 10 different female editors that Fawcett employed. Not necessarily all at the same time, but still, it's got to be an above-average number, certainly for the time. All right. Moving on to Captain Marvel Adventures number 133. This is kind of a change in status quo for Billy Batson. For a long time, Billy's living quarters were left in some question. I mean, in some of the earlier Golden Age stories, we saw Billy dwelling in an apartment. For a time there, he had that... Billy lived in this apartment all by himself. And in this issue, he goes in search of new living quarters, somewhat more homey surroundings. And he finds it in a quaint little cottage called Haven House on Haven Street, somewhere in the city, in a neighborhood described in this story as, quote, a small town in the heart of the city. And his new landlords, the owners of this house, who let Billy a room and cook him meals and enter into his supporting cast from this point forward, are Ma and Pa Potter. And I just think to myself, Otto Binder came up with these characters. He later said he did this, quote, to tone down the superheroics in the Captain Marvel strip and just to bring an air of domestication that I guess would make parents feel more comfortable about reading these things. I don't really know, but it just seems to me that given that Fawcett was in the middle of fending off lawsuits, accusing them of making Captain Marvel too similar to Superman, why would they then add these supporting characters to his supporting cast that make him seem even more similar to Superman? I mean, they're even called Ma and Pa, for crying out loud. In this little small town in the heart of the city, which was certainly not called Smallville, but it certainly feels like it. So, anyway, Billy settles in his new digs, and also in this same story, he's introduced to his new neighbor, boy genius Dexter Knox, who has just invented a better fire extinguisher, which he's hoping to market for money. We're told that his father is handicapped. He's a wheelchair recipient, and the family never has very much money. They're able to get by, but Dexter wants a better life for his family, and so he goes to his little clubhouse in the backyard and cobbles together these super scientific inventions. And in this story, Billy helps Dexter stop the town loafer, or the neighborhood loafer, from stealing this better fire extinguisher. And so Dexter and Ma and Pa Potter both become ongoing supporting characters for Billy Batson, almost to the very end of the 1950s.
Now, Murd, as you said, at this point, the lawsuit is in full swing, right? Just Fawcett's fighting it at this point, correct?
Yes, and they're getting fairly close to laying down arms at this point. But we'll do a little recap of the legal situation at the end here. All right, the very next issue. Marvel Family number 74, excuse me. That's Dexter's next appearance, as he helps the Marvel family beat back an invasion by the Hissing Horror, who are crocodile men from ancient prehistory, who apparently, I don't know whether before or after King Kull's Beastmen dominated humanity, these Hiss Men were dominating humanity. They use an invention of theirs, the time tube, to come forward in time. Apparently the battle against humankind is going poorly for them a couple million years ago, so they come forward in time to kidnap 20th century human beings, to use scientific mumbo-jumbo on them, to turn them into Hiss Men, to swell up their numbers, and to help them to fight their own ancestors. It is kind of a strange tale, but it is one that apparently somebody at Filmation Animation Studios found some virtue in, because there was actually, for one season, a Saturday morning cartoon in 1981 on NBC TV called The Kid Power Hour featuring Shazam. It was produced by Filmation, and it's probably, for my money, the closest thing to an adaptation of the old Golden Age Fawcett Captain Marvel stories that ever appeared in any other medium. And one particular episode was adapted fairly closely to this atomic age, we'll call it, story, the hissing horror. So,
And what year did the cartoon run?
it was in 1981. It's not all that well remembered, but it's got very much the flavor of the old Golden Age.
Yeah, I've never seen one. I mean, I knew it existed, but I've never seen one episode of that. I'll have to try to track that down.
I think you can find a couple of clips on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Terrific.
Yep. And if we, perhaps in a future Spotlight episode, I can say a little bit more about it.
Wonderful.
Let's see. In Marvel Family number 75, more fun with Dexter Knox. He accompanies the Marvel family via an invention of his, the Time Pill, to the far-flung future world of 1960, where the Savannah family has already traveled in time ahead of them, and they're trying to organize the alien residents of the planet Pluto into an invasion force to conquer Earth and its allies within the solar system. So, the Marvels found kind of a Space Cadet Academy, which they call Planet Prep, to train volunteers to stave off the Savannah/Pluto invasion. Very 50s science fictional there. Captain Marvel Adventures number 137, October 1952. This is the first time when the 7 deadly enemies of man, those grotesque statues lining the entranceway into old Shazam's temple, where Billy first got his Shazam powers. This is the first time we see that these 7 deadly enemies of man actually rise up and take a direct hand against Shazam and his agents. There was a story in Captain Marvel Adventures number 41 years earlier when we were told that there's more to these 7 deadly enemies than just funny-looking statues. They were actually evil spirits that acted through agents. Like they would select an avatar, a human being who best represented whatever deadly quality each god pursued. And Dr. Savannah himself was the human representative of Pride, and he acted as like the secretary and parliamentarian of the meetings of these agents of the 7 deadly enemies of man. But in this story, we learn that the statues were actually petrified remains of evil gods that Shazam himself battled and captured eons ago. And King Kull is the one who shows up and frees these 7 deadly enemies and immediately puts them to work in a sweatshop he sets up that he calls Evil Olympus, making sin bombs, which emit a gas that cause any human being who inhales it to become prey to one of the 7 deadly sins. The terms 7 deadly enemies of man and 7 deadly sins are used interchangeably in this story. So Billy Batson and a couple of his friends actually do inhale these sin gases and start acting like real jerks to one another. But eventually Cap is able to, of course, save the day and force these 7 deadly enemies back into their immobile positions in that underground temple where they had been held prisoner for so long. And I'm a little disappointed that the 7 deadly sins aren't characterized. You know, they don't really get to act as characters. And we just kind of see them moving around and we see Captain Marvel punching them. I just feel like something more could have been done with that story. But after all, it's only an 8-pager, and it's 1952. Then in Captain Marvel Family number 76. Chris, I don't think I have ever been prouder of a sentence in the English language that I have personally composed than I am of the sentence I'm about to read. Space gremlins from planet Zorkia are stealing all the peaceful atomic inventions!
Murd?
My goodness.
I'm living vicariously right now through your well-earned pride.
Oh, it is a joy to me, Chris. This story is just so Binder. It is literally a bunch of space gremlins who show up on Earth and are stealing non-violent, non-weaponized atomic inventions. And they inform the Marvels when they catch wise to their plan that they're taking them to benefit their home planet, but they're actually criminals who are stealing these things so they can win a cash prize in a science fair on their home planet. The Marvels follow up and put a stop to this, but they do arrange for a more legitimate exchange of atomic innovations between planet Zorkia and Earth. This is just another example of Otto Binder. You know, as I said, he's very much a pro-science person, and this story is one of several examples of his writing where he tries to promote the positive, benign applications of atomic energy research as opposed to just weaponization of same. And but to his regret, I'm sure, the cover blurb of this issue reads, "Exploding Atomic Terror," which undercuts his intentions somewhat. I think we'll agree.
Indeed.
All right. Now, the next issue, Marvel Family number 77. This is November of 1952. Another UN-inspired story written by Binder. Billy Batson and Mary and Freddie Freeman host a dinner party for a bunch of junior diplomats, teenagers from all over the world, at one of their homes. And King Kull happens to be skulking outside their window because, being a world-destroying villain, of course he's got nothing better to do than spy on teenagers. He trains his yeah, really? He trains his fight ray at the dining table, and suddenly all these international teenagers who had been getting along so well start fighting each other. The Marvels cotton to what's happening and chase King Kull away, but they're inspired by this incident to form a junior United Nations. So they set up. They go on this sort of worldwide trek. They set up an aircraft, which is they call it the Mighty Marvel Airlift, which is basically just a big. It's an ark, but it's a giant wooden glider, basically, powered entirely by Marvel power. And they just go around the world gathering delegates from all the different countries of the world, King Kull trying to foil them every step of the way. But in the end, of course, the good guys triumph and the junior UN is formed. The cover to this issue, though, is a little bit misleading. It suggests a Red Scare angle that's completely absent from the actual story. It shows kind of a hairy, paw-like human hand, which could belong to King Kull, but other contextual cues tell you it clearly doesn't, because the hand is extending out of the green sleeve of what looks like a communist military uniform, and the talon-like fingers are tipped in blood, and it's wearing a red signet ring with an image of a bird inside of it, which tells me that perhaps this was either a rejected cover for the next issue, Marvel Family number 78, or it just ran an issue early by mistake, because it looks like it's supposed to be a villain called the Red Vulture, which we'll hear about in a little bit. But yeah, it sort of suggests sensationalistic Red Scare content that doesn't have much to do with the actual story inside. Whether this is intentional or not is lost to history, but I'd like to think that it was not. Now, here is where things really get kind of interesting and period-appropriate. Captain Marvel Adventures number 139, cover dated December of 1952. This is where Fawcett apparently adopted a new editorial stance on the Korean conflict and how its characters are going to respond to it. And Chris, it is at this point that I step aside on the rostrum and request that you step forward and address our listeners and say a few words about the United States' involvement in the Korean War and the home front attitudes toward it.
Oh, my pleasure, brother. I'll do my hearty best. I'm humbled. So we have to recall that after the Second World War, Korea had been a Japanese colony for decades, and with Japan's defeat, the Allies came in to administer the Korean Peninsula, and Northern Korea, which had a communist movement led by Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He was a sort of a protege of the Soviets, and they backed him in his movement up with funding, weaponry, military advisors. And in the South, the United States was supporting. It wasn't really a democratic country at that point. Really more of a military dictatorship that was opposed to communism. And for the rest of the 40s, you had this uneasy division between the two, and there was talk of reunification and what forth, but that wasn't happening. And then in 1950, apparently with the blessing of Joseph Stalin, Kim Il-sung's North Korean army invaded the South, and the United States was completely unprepared. After World War II, per American tradition, after that point, we downsized our military significantly. We didn't have a lot of troops in South Korea. The South Korean army was new and untested, and the only forces that were close were in Japan, which we were still occupying at that point. But a lot of those troops were, they were on garrison duty. They weren't really battle tested. We rushed over what we could, and ultimately we, fighting with the South Koreans and other allies, because with the United Nations agreed in a Security Council vote, because the Soviets were not participating, they were boycotting, they agreed to come into the aid of South Korea, which was the first time the UN had intervened in a short history up to that point into a military conflict. And the UN forces led by the United States drove North Korea back over the dividing line, which we know is the 38th parallel. And then one of the most controversial decisions of that conflict, General MacArthur, who was in charge of the UN forces and who had an ego the size of Montana, he was one of the great architects of the Pacific campaign against Japan.
He shall return.
But a very controversial figure, though, which is a topic for another time. But MacArthur decided to press on towards the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea. And the Chinese at that time were just come out of their own civil war against the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek, which had fled to Taiwan. And so Mao was very sensitive about, a capitalist nation, because this is very much now in the Cold War, because the Soviets are backing up the North Koreans on his borders, and he warns the United States, if you come any closer, we're going to intervene. And MacArthur, one could argue very foolishly, disregarded that, and his forces pressed on close to Yalu. China sent in hundreds of thousands of ground troops, which the Korean War was essentially won at that point. We had taken Pyongyang, we had defeated the northern military, was in retreat, and the Chinese People's Liberation Army poured into North Korea, knocking us all the way back down past the 38th parallel, and then it became almost a World War I type stalemate, seesaw war, back and forth across the parallel, until final armistice was signed in 1953. Interestingly enough, tying this into current events, there is supposed to be, it's not for sure yet, a summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump in Singapore in June, and one of the topics of discussion may be formally ending the Korean War, because it never actually formally ended. It was just a ceasefire. Hence, it remains one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth, as the two countries are still technically at war. And you talked about the impact it had on the United States. This was an undeclared war, and it was a war right in the wake of the Soviets testing their first atomic bomb. So, So there's a growing sense of fear and paranoia when it came to the so-called Red Menace, the communist menace. And, you had the Rosenberg conspiracy where it was revealed that Americans were involved in a conspiracy to sell atomic secrets from the Manhattan Project to the USSR. So, we all know the duck and cover drills and the films and the sensationalized media that, was really holding up the Soviet Union as the new enemy for the United States. And that was very much resonated in the media, including in comic books. I mean, we call this the Atom Age, right? So the 1950s, even though one could argue it's still technically the Golden Age, this is where we really see the impact of atomic energy and the politics of atomic energy, appearing in these books.
That was exemplary, Chris.
Well, but I did my best, my friend. It was just a shallow scratching of the surface of a very fascinating and complex topic.
It was infinitely better than I could have done. And Chris, this is why you are an indispensable ally in the war. The war on the behalf of comics history. Let's put it that way.
I was wondering where you're going with that. My friend, I'm honored.
All right. So Captain Marvel and the Marvel family now, for much of what would be the final year of their existence in comics, as published by Fawcett, they'll make frequent visits to Korean soil, and they will get into the battle at the UN defense line and around it, various contested spots. And so we get to see here what is a fairly rare glimpse of the Korean War through the superheroic lens, because after all, there weren't very many superhero comics left to look at the Korean War by this point in time. There are a few other examples do exist. Do you recall, Chris, if Captain America Kami Smasher ever dealt directly with Korea?
I must admit to my shame, I never actually. I know the significance of those issues. I've never actually read any of them. Maybe I've flipped through a couple over the years in reprint editions, but I can't answer that. It's very possible. I'm sure someone on the forums can help us out with that. But the Korean War definitely appeared. I mean, the EC War comics featured the Korean War, as did. No, I'm getting ahead of myself there. But no, the EC War comics, Frontline Combat, Two-Fisted Tales, definitely.
All right, so Fawcett's approach to the war was sensationalistic, to say the least. I mean, they're certainly not trying to give us any kind of realistic war tales, but you wouldn't really expect that from Captain Marvel and company. And it does seem to me that they're trying to tap into a pro-war, home front patriotic fervor that simply did not exist at that time. So the very first story that shows this new focus is Captain Marvel Adventures number 139, late in 1952, where Cap personally goes to the UN defense line in Korea, and he comes up against a character called the Red Crusher. And this guy, I mean, it's the caricatures employed in these Korean War era Fawcett comics are just as bad as, or at the very least, very nearly as bad as the worst you could have found during the World War II fervor, where we were seeing all kinds of caricatures of imperialist Japanese and Nazis and so forth. So the Red Crusher is this massive, corpulent, unhealthily yellow-skinned caricature of an Asian, and he has the usual features you would expect: sharp fingernails and sharp teeth. And he also has at his disposal quite a few technological terrors with which he threatens democracy. And the one that he employs in this issue are giant spiked balls that roll roughshod across the battlefield and crush UN troops beneath their points. His dialogue doesn't leave much to the imagination. It's full of exaggerated cant about Yankee dogs and capitalist pigs and American worms and so forth. And meanwhile, the Cap himself and also the narrative captions make liberal use of terms like kami. At one point, the Red Crusher can be heard to exclaim, "Great Buddha," even though Buddhism is not exactly a majority religion in Korea, and I doubt it was even back then. But Captain Marvel is able to put an end to the threat that the Red Crusher poses. And then he was able to return to the United States to engage in more typical Captain Marvel adventures for the rest of the issue.
Well, Murd, wait, but the Red Crusher is a communist entity, right?
Well, yes.
Okay, so that's silly because he wouldn't be citing Buddha, because communism, if you're really going all the way with it, is an atheistic ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting.
Yes, it certainly is. So there's the other things that happen in this same issue that have less to do with wartime sensationalism. Captain Marvel fights a magical mirror duplicate of himself called Netpak Levrum, which you may remember from The Good Humor Man is Captain Marvel spelled backwards. It was created by a magician called Wizzo the Wizard as a kind of his senior project just before his graduation from a school for black magicians. And so Captain Marvel battles Netpak Levrum, who speaks in reverse English and follows whatever order Wizzo gives him. Cap is able to send him peacefully back into the mirror at the end of the story. And the third story, this is especially bizarre. There is a rash of mysterious kidnappings happening around the city. Captain Marvel investigates and finds that it's a giant spider that's been committing them. It's been snatching people clear up into the sky at the end of a web strand. He finds that the web strand's other end attaches to a hovering airship and that the spider is a giant robot. And the whole thing is a plot by Lem Legree, who is a direct descendant of Simon Legree, the evil plantation owner from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he's trying to single-handedly revive the institution of slavery. Now, there's not the strong racial component here that you might expect, because he's kidnapping exclusively white citizens of the city to do his bidding, but he sentences them all to hard labor on some godforsaken little rocky patch of ground that he's decided to farm. It doesn't seem likely that he'd ever turn a profit in such an area. He seems to be just doing this for the sheer power trip thrill of subjecting his fellow human beings to cruelty. But there you have it. Lem Legree is attempting to bring back slavery using giant mechanical spiders. And, of course, Captain Marvel is having none of it, and this very strange story ends happily.
How could it otherwise? Talk about a bit of a literary reach there. Wow, they're going all the way back to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. That same month, over in Marvel Family, issue number 78, we see more evidence of the new attempt to cash in on the Korean War conflict in sensational comics form. The Marvel Family goes up against another stereotypical North Korean commie villain called the Red Vulture, who is utterly indistinguishable from the Red Crusher. He looks almost exactly the same. Only difference is that he likes to he favors airships, and in this case starships, because he's raining down mysterious Red Death upon the Allied or UN forces in Korea. And the Captain Marvel and the Marvel family, they go to try to discover the source of these aerial bombardments, and they discover that he set up a space station. They seek out this thing, which is called the Red Star of Death. And it looks like... And the characters actually do utter at some point in this... Once they discover the Red Star of Death, they mistake it at first for a small moon. And one of them says, "That's no moon, it's a space station."
It's too big to be a space station.
Yeah, so this is... I would not be surprised at all. I mean, it's George Lucas at this point would probably be surprised by it, but I don't know how well he remembers his own influences by now. But I would not be surprised if it were learned that young George Lucas had in his collection a copy of Marvel Family number 78, and if it might have inspired him to create his own Star of Death.
Considering his love of the medium, it's certainly plausible, my friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in addition to his Red Star of Death, the Red Vulture had... he also wielded a vehicular weapon called the Red Grinder, which is basically a big transparent plexiglass ball with a circular saw blade around it that he would drive around, mowing down helpless American troops. Not dissimilar to the murder module that the Leader would later drive in Marvel's Incredible Hulk comics. And we see scenes of the Red Vulture working Republic of Korea, South Korean prisoners to the point of death, quote, violating all international codes of war. Oh, the fiends, the inhuman commie fiends. Yeah, but the Marvel family, in the end, of course, make as short work of him as they do of the Red Crusher in another comic published in the same month. All right, moving on now to January of 1953 and the final year of the publication of Captain Marvel comics by Fawcett. We'll start with Captain Marvel Adventures number 140, in which Fawcett's new last-ditch emphasis on war and horror turns downright lurid. In fact, both genres converging in a single story in this issue. But first, Captain Marvel fights off the Hand of Horror. All right, so this story is... It's set in Sinister Swamp, where a team of archaeologists, accompanied by cub reporter Billy Batson, of course, and also by the archaeologist's pretty blonde teenage secretary Betty, venture into Sinister Swamp to investigate some local legends. Billy is forced to turn into Captain Marvel to save Betty from some alligators, and while he's under the swamp dispatching those alligators, he comes across something peculiar, and he dredges up from the bottom of the swamp a gigantic humanoid body. It's apparently the swamp water mummified corpse of some prehistoric giant. Some 20, 30 feet tall. It's missing a hand, the archaeologists note, and they think that's somewhat curious. They make camp for the night. And but in the night, the muffled screams are heard, and members of the party mysteriously disappear. Eventually, it comes to light that it's the giant's severed hand crawling on its 4 digits and opposable thumb across the ground and snatching members of the party away to their dooms as it tries to make its way to and reunite itself with the giant body. This ultimately does happen, and as soon as the two members are reunited, the giant comes to life, and it briefly goes on a rampage until Captain Marvel subdues, defeats, and slays it. And that's kind of the end of the story. But so that's the Hand of Horror for you. It's as I said, getting a little bit more lurid as time passes. It's one of the goriest attempts at true horror that Fawcett attempted with Captain Marvel. And then the second story, showing how much more tasteful things are getting, is called The Mongol Blood Drinkers. This was the cover story, and the cover did feature an image of a giant, bright yellow-skinned vampire head with Captain Marvel flying right towards its heavily befanged mouth, ready to punch it in its kisser, with the legend beneath it reading, "Horror stalks the battlefield." So as I said, war and horror, both slowly overtaking the Fawcett Publishing line, even that bastion of wholesome American heroic purity, Captain Marvel and his Marvel family. And the Mongol blood drinkers, as their name implies, are communist vampires. Their ringleader is called the Scarlet Vampire. He wears a red robe with a big black bat on his chest, and he howls into the night sky in the first panel of his story, "I want rich American blood!" Yes, and so the story revolves around Captain Marvel flying blood donations from a Red Cross blood drive. Billy Batson had been stayed up all night long plugging or promoting this blood drive. It was like a marathon broadcast, just nonstop urging the citizens of the city to go and donate blood to save the lives of those brave United Nations troops at the Korean front. And then Captain Marvel takes over for Billy and actually delivers all that blood that Billy helped to raise. So this story kind of doubles as an actual real-world plug for these Red Cross blood drives, which were actually happening around the country at the time. And then Captain Marvel delivers the blood supply, and sure enough, the medical base he delivers it to is then raided by the Scarlet Vampire and his undead legions as they feast upon that rich American blood that they so crave. And Captain Marvel then, of course, tracks them down. He actually defeats them by going to the sun and bringing a little blob of it down with him to bring premature sunrise to the battlefield that the vampires are stalking. Their success at the blood bank has emboldened them to try and sup upon the blood of living soldiers. And they've actually made a pact with the communist regimes of China and North Korea to feast exclusively on the UN troops and not on the communist troops. But Captain Marvel puts a stop to that with his little sun blob and also with a very long wooden stake. So that's the end of the Mongol blood drinkers. Ahem. A slightly more fun story, but only a little bit less horrific, can be found that same month, January 1953, in Marvel Family number 79. And that involves the Marvel family taking on the Mad Mummy. And I would put the emphasis on the Mad because from the front cover on, I mean, Mad Magazine was a fairly new concept at that point, so I don't know if this was a deliberate swipe of Mad Magazine that they decided to call this character the Mad Mummy. But the front cover shows the three members of the Marvel family making silly faces at this grotesque, rotting mummy creature, and it running away in horror at the sight of them, saying, "Yay, get me out of here." So it's you might call it humor in a jugular vein. As goodness knows, that's what Mad Magazine called it. I don't know if this was a deliberate, I wouldn't call it a tribute exactly, but a nod towards the relatively new Mad Magazine, but I suppose it's possible. So the Mad Mummy is this ancient and very powerful maniacal monster that SHAZAM himself imprisoned in a pyramid 5,000 years ago. And SHAZAM then sunk the pyramid to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And at the beginning of this story, archaeologists are just now finding this baffling pyramid at the bottom of the ocean. And, of course, Billy, Mary, and Freddie happen to be on hand, and they transform into the Marvel family and volunteer to raise this underwater pyramid. When the scientists tell them that it weighs millions of tons and they can't possibly move it, they simply jauntily reply, "Professor, the word can't doesn't exist in our dictionary," and off they go. But, of course, they awaken the Mad Mummy, and his dynasty of horror lives again. He drags out his super weapon, the Horn of Howling Horrors, which can not only summon just swarms of various ghoulies and ghosties to his beck and call to help him conquer the world, it can also generate a sonic destructive blast powerful enough to reach halfway across the universe and blow the Rock of Eternity out of the sky. So there are some fairly serious stakes here. But still, the Marvel family do, as they always do, manage to prevail over the Mad Mummy.
And Murd, I prevailed over my domestic tasks. I have returned.
I do admire you, sir, the way you're able to multitask that way. Now, I was just finishing up describing a horror story in which the Marvel family take out the Mad Mummy. But a more, well, to me at least, a more interesting detail of this story is the fact that for once in the entire friggin' Golden Age, Billy Batson is shown in casually attired in something other than that red sweater with the yellow collar. I mean, he's seen wearing other things from time to time, like just clothing that's specific to the story, like a tuxedo or a hiking outfit or a diver's suit. But anytime he's just kind of sitting around casually being Billy Batson, doing his everyday activities, he's always wearing that same stupid red and yellow shirt. In fact, you can't see me, of course, but I'm sitting here wearing a red polo shirt right now in observance of Billy's fashion choices. But in this one story, Marvel Family number 79, whoever drew it did him a kindness and actually allowed him to change his clothes. He's wearing an orange polo shirt with kind of a black quatrefoil pattern on it. So thank goodness we know that Billy does own at least one other shirt. Marvel Family number 80. The Marvels go up against the Great Red Brain. So this is another anti-communist Korea story, of course. The Great Red Brain is a gigantic brain, not literally red in color, but red because it's been indoctrinated with communist, socialist philosophy, invented by an equally evil and equally Asian mad scientist named Tong. It had the power.
Oh, God.
Yes, Tong. Just plain Tong. Just one name, like Cher. But it had powerful enough force of mind that it could do what very few other villains throughout the 40s and 50s could do, hypnotize the Marvels. But instead of simply, doing something that would kill them more directly, it just hypnotized them into first saying their magic words and becoming human again, then forgetting those magic words, and then sending them outdoors from the Red Brain's Antarctic base to die of exposure in the snow. And, of course, the Marvels are more resourceful than all that. They sneak back inside, trick the Great Red Brain into revealing their magic words to them again, become the Marvels again, and they smash the Red Brain, and Tong, of course, also does die in that story. Also in this same issue, the Marvel family encounters the grave-robbing Space Ghoul. This is another one of those don't judge a book by its cover type stories. The comic book creators in general had come under some fire earlier in the 40s over how good guys are portrayed as handsome or otherwise attractive just normal-looking human beings, whereas the villains often were shown to be monstrous or primitive in appearance, and in reality, phrenology aside, personality traits are not always that easily mapped against physical traits. So I guess this is another one of those stories where the Fawcett creators were trying to do their part to disprove that, because when the grave-robbing Space Ghoul appears on Earth, there are actually two aliens emerging from the spacecraft. One of them is green-skinned but relatively human-looking, and the other is this non-humanoid, hairy, betentacled monster. But the Marvels then save the green-skinned humanoid from the monster. The monster escapes, and in the end, of course, it turns out that it's actually the one that they chose to help. That is the flesh-eating Space Ghoul. And the other one was actually an outer space good Samaritan who was trying to track him down and bring him to justice. But by the end of the story, the Marvels realized their mistake, that they should not have judged an alien by its cover, and hopefully the young readers will have learned the same lesson. Captain Marvel Adventures number 142. The cover story there, Captain Marvel runs afoul of the femme fatale known as Black Beauty. And she is an aspiring female crime lord who has raven black hair and dresses all in black. And she's tired of hearing, as she explains, that this is a man's world, and she's decided that she's going to show that a woman can do anything better than a man, even crime. And she emphasizes her point by single-handedly just strolling into a crime lair of a small-time gang and physically overpowering every member of the gang and shooting its current leader to death. So this is
Huh.
she's a fairly formidable figure, and you get the impression that this is kind of what another Golden Age female opponent of Captain Marvel, Aunt Minerva, must have been like when she got started in crime, when she was a young woman. But she is as beautiful as she is deadly, and she does give Captain Marvel a handful, primarily by using Captain Marvel's legendary bashfulness around women against him.
That was the question I was going to ask. Is he a stuttering and inept around her, or?
Chris, that is exactly what happens.
Okay.
Yes.
Fumbling and so forth.
Yes, and feeling that he, as a part of his code of honor, he can't directly strike a woman. But he still is able to lay her low and this is somewhat disappointing. I mean, it's the message becomes strikingly less feminist by the end of the story than it was at the beginning. He just protests love to her, and she falls for it, and then when he double-crosses her and takes out her gang, she just breaks down into sobs and allows herself to be taken into custody. So that's a little too bad. Other stuff that happens in this story, the Red Crusher comes back for round 2, and this time he's wielding a lightning machine that's raining down storms of terror upon the UN troops. He dies in a plane crash at the end of this story, but that doesn't stop him from somehow coming back for one more go-round before the 50s are over. We've also got in this story the launch of Station Whiz's very own orbiting broadcast satellite / space station, the Whiz World Watchtower, and the horror trend even begins to affect Mr. Talkie Tawny, who, as of the 142nd issue of Captain Marvel Adventures, is still a mainstay. He's still got his ongoing series of backup stories, but he gets a horror-oriented one in this issue. A bloodthirsty were-tiger is stalking the city, and Mr. Tawny is suspect number 1. But fairly soon, Billy tumbles to the fact that it's not Mr. Tawny, but his new roommate, John Jones. He took on a boarder so that Mr. Tawny wouldn't feel lonely anymore. He'd have someone to play checkers with. But John Jones, as it turns out, is the were-tiger, and he went out of his way to seek lodgings with Mr. Tawny because he knew that Mr. Tawny would be blamed for the were-tiger's slayings around town. This story is also notable, at least to me, because it acknowledges that whenever Billy is captured, overpowered and captured in human form by one of his many opponents, first thing they do is always tie a gag around his mouth. Even if they don't know that he can say Shazam and become Captain Marvel, they always put the gag on him. And the writers are always coming up with the most preposterous imaginable ways for Billy to get that gag off of his face and say Shazam at the last possible moment. He just holds his face up to an open flame or to a whirling buzzsaw blade or to the slime-coated fang of some giant monster, and somehow is able to manipulate the gag off his mouth at the last second and say Shazam without any injury to himself. This time, however, in this horror story featuring the were-tiger, Billy tries to pry his gag off of his face on the were-tiger's fangs and ends up puncturing himself in the throat.
Yikes!
So I guess
now, how graphic is it portrayed?
Not very. I mean,
okay.
Again, Fawcett did still have some standards, and they didn't drench themselves too much in the blood and the gore. But it incapacitated him enough that he had to. He wasn't able to say Shazam immediately. But at least they do finally acknowledge that this little ploy of prying off the gag, that Billy could get seriously hurt trying to do this, and now that they've. Fawcett has embraced the horror genre to the extent it has in 1953. They can do so in what was for them somewhat graphic fashion.
Right.
All right, and speaking of horror, that same month in the Captain Marvel story in Whiz Comics number 153, Captain Marvel and the Death Horror. And the Death Horror, as it turns out, it's just a criminal scientist in a Grim Reaper costume who portrays himself as Death. And he tries to hold the city for ransom using a ray machine of his design that created the illusion that everyone in the city had been turned into skeletons. So, and that's what he uses as leverage. But Captain Marvel sees through it, of course, and defeats him. And also in that same month, we go back to Korea once again in Marvel Family number 81, in which the Marvel family, with help from dog-faced soldier Captain Inch Wade, so called because he refused to give an inch, not one doggone inch. Yeah, the opening captions of the story describe him as a typical American soldier. Not brilliant, not especially imaginative, but very, very stubborn. And
Well, being stubborn in battle can sometimes be a double-edged sword. From what I read in history, anyway.
I easily accept and embrace and laud the truth of your words there, Chris. But whoever wrote this...
they're only going with the shiny side of the blade here, clearly.
Oh, yeah, well said, Chris. So wielding the shiny blade of his stubbornness, Captain Inchwade is kind of a help to the Marvels in this story as they go up against that colossal communist Mong the Giant, who we learn is actually a very diminutive communist nicknamed the Red Runt by his comrades. He takes special size-changing pills to enhance himself for battle. He grows to, when we first see him, he's only about 8 feet tall, then becomes 12, then 20, till finally he's skyscraper size. But the Marvel family, again, with help from Captain Inchwade and his troops, are able to put a stop to his rampage. Just a personal observation here. There's a possibility that Captain Inchwade might have been named after the longtime Fawcett staff writer Manly Wade Wellman. Yes, Manly was actually his first name, believe it or not.
I was going to ask that. Okay.
Wade was his middle name. He's one of the most prolific writers Fawcett had, even though his heart was never entirely in it. He was one of those comics writers that was in it strictly for the money. Believed himself to be a serious novelist and contributed extensively to other media of fiction. And he was also one of those writers. He might possibly have written the third greatest number of Captain Marvel stories after Otto Binder and Bill Woolfolk. But he was one of those Fawcett employees who actually turned state evidence against the company and testified against them in the D.C. Fawcett trial.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay.
So I don't know if Captain Inchwade really is inspired by Manly Wade Wellman, but it wouldn't surprise me. And also in that story, a journey into somewhat lighter fantasy. More mysterious kidnappings are happening around the city. This is practically an epidemic. It's not Lem Legree bringing back slavery this time, though. It's somebody else bringing back slavery. It's apparently it's the Pasha Plunda, who is a ruler of ancient Baghdad, using the magic of Aladdin's lamp. He got annoyed with his subjects, so he used the magic of the lamp to kill them all with Black Plague, and now he decides he needs new subjects, so he does the logical thing and uses magic to travel forward in time to 20th century America and kidnaps a bunch of people to be his new subjects.
So he's an egomaniac who needs the fawning pseudo-adoration of the masses, but he murdered the original subjects that he had, thereby making his life far more difficult.
Yeah, and he just, when the Marvels confront him with the unconscionability of his acts, he just kind of shrugs and says, why not? He has the power to kill them all, why shouldn't he? So the Marvels go back in time.
It's all fake news anyway, Murd. Go ahead.
Love it.
He didn't really kill all those people, come on.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The Marvels then go back and rescue all their countrymen, and while back there, they get the help of Aladdin himself. And in a nod to the original Aladdin story of the 1001 Arabian Nights, there's not only a magic lamp but a magic ring. There are actually 2 different genie-inhabited objects in that story, and we get to see Aladdin using his magic ring to combat Pasha Plunda with the genie of his magic lamp. And good does, of course, prevail, and the Marvel family, Aladdin, and all the kidnapped people escape old Baghdad on the back of a gigantic magic carpet as Pasha Plunda, in a fit of passion, brings down all of Baghdad upon his own ears in a failed attempt to kill all of his victims. And then Aladdin goes back in time with the magic ring and promises to undo all the damage that Pasha Plunda had done. So, something of a happy ending there. Captain Marvel Adventures number 144. This is a full-length story in which, once again, Dr. Sivana... actually, I apologize. It is not a full-length story. It's a 3-part story, and the fourth part of that issue is the third appearance of the Red Crusher and the final time, which is good riddance. But the lead feature is another Dr. Sivana story where he once again invades the Rock of Eternity and once again takes old SHAZAM captive. And this time he uses SHAZAM as leverage to try and get the SHAZAM Elders, the 6 gods whose powers Captain Marvel wields, to, in order to teach Captain Marvel a lesson, one at a time strip their powers from him. So Cap first loses the wisdom of Solomon, and he can't solve a riddle that Dr. Sivana gloatingly sends him, at which point Sivana just says, okay, here's the answer to the riddle. Here's where to come find me in my fortress stronghold. But then as Cap attempts to besiege said stronghold, he one by one loses all the other powers of Shazam. And it's at this point we definitively learn that Captain Marvel's peerless invulnerability actually falls under the heading of the power of Zeus. We have official confirmation of that in this story, for those who have wondered. But then at the end, when Captain Marvel is reduced to just a powerless and lacking the courage of Achilles, cowardly human being, that's when Sivana comes, ties him and old Shazam down in the desert to die of exposure. But then Shazam reveals to Captain Marvel that the solution to this conundrum is not for Captain Marvel to defeat Sivana, but for Billy to do it. So Cap says Shazam, becomes Billy, and just goes right over to Sivana and punches him in the jaw as Billy. And that's the end of the story. It's the moral here being that sometimes all you need is good old human stick-to-itiveness to solve a problem. Sometimes you don't always need a magic word to solve your everyday problems, I guess could be the takeaway. Plus, it's just nice to see Billy fight his own battles for a change. Marvel Family number 83, out that same month of May of 1953. The lead story has Pa Potter, who you remember was the landlord of Billy Batson, kind of his adoptive father figure, taking Billy and Mary and Freddie off on a treasure hunt using an old treasure map he found. There's a lot of old treasure maps lying around Fawcett City, it seems. And they come across a crew of undead pirates led by the Scarlet Skull, and they're guarding a cursed treasure. And apparently they're allowed to stalk the earth as undead pirates for as long as they can keep anyone from coming across their haunted treasure chest. The plot is not dissimilar to the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, actually. Though I'm pretty sure that unlike the Star Wars Death Star, this is a total coincidence. And the second feature there, more of the spotty track record that Fawcett has had with the portrayal of Native Americans in their Golden Age comics. In some ways, their treatment of American Indians have been somewhat progressive, and in others, less so. The story I'm about to talk about is kind of a combination of both. The Marvel family are on vacation in their human identities to the American Southwest. They're visiting the Pueblo cliff dwellings, where they come across a petty criminal, kind of the black sheep of his local reservation, called Dull Tomahawk. And he's kind
my God.
Yeah. He's kind of a sad sack. He's the grandson of a once mighty Indian chief who fought many victorious campaigns against white interlopers. And he wants those days to come again, but he's too much of a schlub to actually bring this to pass. But in escaping from the Marvel family in the catacombs underneath the cliff dwellings, he does come across the tomb of an all-powerful and malign ancient spirit calling itself Chief Thundercloud, which looks like a giant vaporous, just a caricature of an Indian chief's head who likes to say ugh, ugh a lot. But Dull Tomahawk then is in freeing Chief Thundercloud. He acquires kind of his own personal genie, which he wants to use to try to bring his own dreams of power and glory to fruition. He uses Thundercloud to blow the Marvel family away, and then he goes back to the reservation and tries to declare to his fellow tribesmen, "I'm going to be your leader now, and we're going to, slaughter the palefaces or whatever." And and here's one of the brighter spots of this story. His modern tribesmen are just not taking him seriously in the least. One of them actually says, go on, listen to you. You've been watching too many cowboy and Indian movies. So, Dull Tomahawk, his proposals have been rejected from the far less stereotypical and less caricatured fellow members of his tribe, whatever tribe that happens to be. Eventually he gets the upper hand on the Marvels and ties them to stakes and is about to scalp them when suddenly he realizes, oh, wait, I've never scalped anybody before. I've only seen it done in movies. I don't know what I'm doing. So that's another sort of comedic moment there. So he just kind of calls on Dull Tomahawk. I mean, he calls on Chief Thundercloud to do the job for him, but the Marvels outwit Chief Thundercloud and manage to re-imprison him back in his tomb under the cliff dwellings. And the thread is finally ended when Mary Marvel takes matters into her own hands and just basically delivers she backhands Dull Tomahawk in the back of the head and says something like, You need to grow up, and that's the resolution of that story. It's I think it's the last treatment of American Indians we see in Fawcett comics of the 40s and 50s. It's not the worst portrayal we've seen, but it's certainly not the best.
Well, we have to remember also, Murd, that like you said, the whole cowboy and Indian genre was immensely popular in media at that time. I mean, Westerns in the movies were huge in the 1940s and 50s. Mm-hmm. So, many of them obviously had a very, the very stereotypical view of the American Indian. There were exceptions, like some of the John Ford classics like Fort Apache, or then later on his masterpiece, The Searchers, are more subtle. But, that's, again, it's reflecting the time period very much here.
Mm. And we certainly can't put this on a par with those John Ford films you mentioned, Chris, but there is a sort of comedic, subversive humor here, where it's kind of overturning the stereotypical treatment of such peoples in other media. Let's see. In Captain Marvel Adventures number 145, June 1953, yet another recurring wacky scientist, nutty professor character enters the mix. This is kind of a revised version of a much earlier Golden Age recurring character named Professor Edgewise. Professor Edgewood Q. Smith, nicknamed Edgewise. He's been reincarnated here as Professor Edgewise. That's literally his last name as opposed to just a nickname. And apparently the earlier version of Professor Edgewise has been put on some good antipsychotic medication because he's a bit mellower than he used to be. He's also put on a good amount of weight. And he's now just kind of an absent-minded professor. He's just forgetful as opposed to having borderline psychotic episodes in which he forgets how his legs work or literally doesn't remember which way is up, which is kind of how the character was portrayed in the early 40s. He had been a supporting character of Captain Marvel Jr.'s strip for about 6 or 7 years at this point. But now he's introduced into Captain Marvel's supporting cast as yet another recurring wacky scientist to introduce super scientific plot devices that can propel stories. In fact, he figures in both of the stories in Captain Marvel Adventures number 145. Now, going on the same month, June of 1953, we see a couple of long-running Fawcett Captain Marvel-related comics come to a close. First, Whiz Comics number 155, the final issue of that series, which, as I mentioned earlier, was at one time Fawcett's flagship title and the birthplace of Captain Marvel. The Captain Marvel story of this issue is very much a horror story, one of the scarier ones that Fawcett published at this time. A plague of giant scorpion bats are infesting Captain Marvel's city. They're capturing people and putting them into storage as food for consumption at a later time by their master, who turns out to be the legendary Kraken, this gigantic octopoid monster. Captain Marvel intervenes, and before any of his citizenry are actually consumed, one hopes, he does one-on-one battle with the Kraken and punches it so hard that it lands hundreds of miles away in the desert and immediately dies of dehydration. So, yeah, but... the other stories in this issue, again, talking about the influence of the war and horror genres on comics in general in the 50s and on Fawcett in particular. The other two stories are a generic horror story hosted by a figure called Dr. Death, and also a generic war story. So this kind of brings a sad, seamy end to what was once a mainstay of the golden age of comics.
Well, Murd, we should point out also that Seduction of the Innocent comes out in 1954, so it seems like, and again, correct me if you think my interpretation is off base, that, Fawcett, in its own more family-friendly way, is still trying to emulate some of the stuff going on in the EC books.
Well, yeah, I think it's absolutely the case that they're trying to emulate things that were going on at EC. And also true that it's a more family-friendly approach. I mean, I say it's sad and seamy, but still, you're right, compared to the the level of gore that EC and some of their less scrupulous imitators, less scrupulous than both EC and than Fawcett, were cranking out into the marketplace at the time. It is definitely much more sanitary than that.
And I mentioned Seduction of the Innocent. I'm sure many of our listeners know the Frederick Wortham Screed, which went a long way in, really hurting the comics market and causing the comics companies to censor themselves through the now infamous Comics Code seal. And, of course, many historians feel a lot of that was done really just to undermine EC's success and popularity.
Oh, yes, without question. All right. Now, at the same time that Whiz Comics was having its final issue, Captain Marvel Jr.'s solo series came to a close. Captain Marvel Jr. had also been appearing continuously for many years in Master Comics, but that run had ended 2 months earlier in Master Comics number 133. And here we see the final Captain Marvel Jr. solo story of the 40s and 50s in Captain Marvel Jr. number 119. The cover image shows Jr. getting executed in the electric chair.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, somewhat graphic. He's got a very strange look on his face. And it's not just that he's about to be electrocuted. The juice is flowing through him, and he is grimacing in shock and pain. So, again, this is comparatively tame, compared to some of the things that were being published elsewhere. But still, it's kind of sad that Fawcett has come to this. And at that same month in Marvel Family number 84, the Marvel Family has their last Donnybrook with the Savannah family. This is making their last appearance of the Golden Age. The following month, Marvel Family number 85, proof once again that gorillas sell comics. The Marvel, yeah, this is the Marvel Family's version of that. As I have in my notes here.
Jamie D is smiling at you right now, my friend.
Oh, I hope so. I hope he's looking down and going, "Ook, ook, baby." Yeah, so the Marvel Family City, which I'm avoiding saying Fawcett City as much as I can because, as we've pointed out in other spotlights, that was actually a latter-day invention. The Marvel Family's home city was never identified by name in the 40s and 50s comics. It wasn't until later on in the 70s that Fawcett City was provided as a name for their hometown. But whatever that hometown's name is, it's visited by a delegation from what appears to be a city full of intelligent primates, hidden somewhere in the forests of, I believe, Central or South America. It's not Africa. But so this would appear to be a kind of like Fawcett's own version of Gorilla City quite a few years before The Flash ever visited DC's Gorilla City for the first time. So they gather up volunteer laborers from Captain Marvel City to come down and help them with a public works project down there in their Gorilla City. The Marvel family go along out of curiosity, and they meet King Zonga, the leader of this intelligent gorilla colony. But they soon discover some skullduggery down there in the jungle because these talking gorillas are actually not true gorillas. They are innocent human beings who've been dosed by King Zonga with what he calls his primate potion and turned into sentient gorillas that are totally subservient to Zonga himself. And as for Zonga, he's human also. He's actually an evil primatologist called Professor Ira Glute. He has to turn himself back into a human being periodically using his homo hormone, in order to prevent his mind from becoming fuzzy and simian and suggestible as his human-turned gorilla slaves were. At one point, he doses Billy, Mary, and Freddy with so much primate potion, they regress into monkeys and even lose the ability to speak so that they can't say their magic words.
Of course.
However, they are able to sneak back into the city and take a dose of homo hormone so that they become human again, become the Marvels again. And just as Dr. Glute as King Zonga is about to dose the entire planet Earth with the primate potion. In fact, I think he does turn a significant fraction of the planet into gorillas. Brilliantly anticipating 1999's JL Ape event by decades. They're able to put a stop to all of this. The reader is still treated to the comedic side of a planet full of intelligent gorillas, with apologies to Pierre Boulle and his Monkey Planet story, which I don't think had been written yet as of 1953, although I could be wrong. But they're able to defeat King Zonga and return the world to its human state. So enough of that monkey business. In Captain Marvel Adventures number 148, the following month, it's another Dr. Savannah story, where Dr. Savannah finally has Billy Batson sealed up in an escape-proof death trap. He's got him sealed in a clear plastoid block, kind of like a coffin-like in shape, really. He doesn't kill Billy because he wants him to suffer, but Savannah seals him up in this block, renders him completely immobile, unable to speak, and just launches it into orbit, where Billy is going to be sent there perfectly preserved in amber, as it were, and perfectly conscious of his suffering and his inability to free himself for all time to come, while he can look on and watch Dr. Savannah conquer the world. But just after Dr. Savannah has done this, a technologically superior hidden Andean civilization, calling themselves the Azpacs, show up, and they're about to conquer the world and take it right out from under Dr. Savannah. And they target Savannah as their number one competition, and Savannah barely escapes them alive. And he realizes, to his chagrin, that he needs Captain Marvel to save this world so that he can conquer it himself. So he frees Billy Batson, very much begrudgingly, and together they take down the Azpacs. And the Azpacs, on the final panel, promise, now we'll form a democracy and join the UN. Because that's the solution to everything. And other stuff happening in this issue. Another appearance of boy genius Dexter Knox as Captain Marvel helps him bust a robot ghost. So this is a very Benderian idea, the notion that there could be such a thing as a lingering electronic signal of a deceased artificial intelligence. But yeah, Dexter had created an experimental robot and then scrapped it and buried it in the yard, but it's still able to manifest itself through the electrical outlets in his laboratory as a robot ghost. And so Billy and Dexter have to, I think they solve the problem by exiling the robot ghost to the moon. But it's just, again, Binder was kind of a little bit ahead of his time, I think, as far as robot-related science fiction. And in that same issue, the world's mightiest mortal versus the world. As it turns out in this story, the Earth actually has its own form of consciousness. The whole story is narrated by the world, actually. It's his internal monologue, as it laments about all these pesky little human beings crawling around on its buttocks and mining it for natural resources. It itches. Strip mining itches like crazy, Chris, if you didn't know. So it starts triggering all these natural disasters across its surface to try and decrease the human pest population a little bit. But Captain Marvel thwarts it. And in the end, it's not just a monologue it's not just the Earth talking to itself. It actually enters into dialogue with its brother, the Moon, at one point, where the Moon reminds the Earth how lucky it is to have human inhabitants, like Captain Marvel, who can defend the Earth from external threats, as Captain Marvel does in this story. It deflects a meteor shower or something to save the Earth from peril. So in the end, the Earth decides to release its grudge against the human race and just be a more amicable host in the future. Then we're really in the home stretch here now. Captain Marvel Adventures number 149, which a salute to our absent brother Pants right now, is the penultimate issue of Captain Marvel Adventures, the second to last. And this it's an interestingly narrated story. It's got a dual narration thing going, where Captain Marvel is relating directly to the reader, being self-effacing and modest, and trying to downplay or diminish his accomplishments as much as possible. Meanwhile, there's an exaggeration-prone reporter named, I think, Jack Todd, who was covering the whole affair, who is lionizing Captain Marvel. So you've got two different unreliable narrators telling the story, while the art in the panel shows the way the story actually played out. It's Captain Marvel's extended efforts to... he performs a dizzying multitude of heroic feats to save an agency of the United Nations, there's the UN again, from King Kull the Beastman. And as it turns out, the payoff at the end, the most difficult task of this series was accepting credit. Because it shows Captain Marvel standing there at a UN award ceremony, getting a medal pinned on his chest and sweating bullets.
Well, we all know how humble Cap is.
No, it's one of his most endearing traits, isn't it?
Indeed.
And then in that same month, Marvel Family number 87. Interesting story here. There is something of a status quo change for Billy, Freddie, and Mary happening here. Just a little bit too late to really matter, since by now we are 2 months away from the bitter end. But in this story, Pa Potter again, Billy's landlord and adoptive father figure, he opens up one of the antiques in the antique shop that he runs. And it releases kind of a cloud of vapor that turns out to contain germs of an ancient disease called the pinhead plague, which causes its sufferers' heads to shrink rapidly. And in the final stages, in the death throes, the victim then it feels no pain but starts laughing uncontrollably, and it just kind of, in its way, it's kind of a more horrifying symptom than some others you could imagine. But the Marvel family then venture into the heart of commie-infested Cambodia to try and find a disgraced and exiled pathologist who's taken up residence in Cambodia who might be able to help them come up with a cure for the pinhead plague. But Pa Potter can only be moved under very specific circumstances, or else his condition could worsen instantly. He could die instantly. So they're obliged to take the entire house, the Ma and Pa Potter's entire house, with them over to Cambodia to seek this pathologist's help. And the pathologist turns out to be dirty and corruptible because the local communist officials have gotten to him, the local warlords. And they pay him off and try to get him to get his hands on the pinhead plague germs so that they can weaponize them. The Marvel family, of course, puts a stop to this, but in the course of that battle, I think the Cambodians are able to animate a giant stone statue to fight the Marvels, but the stone statue falls over and destroys the Potter's house. Ma and Pa Potter are both perfectly safe as a result. They don't come to harm. And a cure is found for the pinhead plague, and the germs are destroyed, so it's no longer a threat. But meanwhile, the Potter's house has been destroyed, and Pa Potter is going to need at least a year to recuperate from this devastating medical condition he's had. So what that all adds up to is that Billy can't live with the Potters anymore. So the solution to that is Billy and Mary both move in with Freddie Freeman. And Freddie Freeman's had his own little his home has been in a boarding house elsewhere in the city. And he's had, for several years now, since 1947, his own little supporting cast of fellow roomers. And so that supporting cast, for a very brief span, also becomes the supporting cast of Billy and Mary. They become the supporting cast of the whole Marvel family. As in the Marvel family number 87, they all move in together. All of this goes down in October of 1953. Now, in November of 1953, we see the final issue of Captain Marvel Adventures, number 150. The cover story features Captain Marvel's wedding to a witch. Who is she's disguising herself as the attractive secretary for a broom manufacturing company, and she's been secretly kidnapping its employees to make brooms for her for a new generation of witches she's planning to start up. And she tries to finagle Captain Marvel into marrying her, and of course Captain Marvel's legendary bashfulness comes into play yet again, but he's able to outwit the witch, and she reverts to her normal, hideous, elderly form at midnight. So he's able to stall the wedding proceedings long enough that she reverts to her witch form in front of all the wedding guests and the attending news media. So that puts an end to her little plot. But the rest of this issue, the other 3/4 of this final issue of Captain Marvel Adventures number 150, is the final duel between Captain Marvel and Dr. Sivana in the 40s and 50s. And that involves Dr. Sivana conquering a small African nation which happens to have a rich deposit of a rare isotope of a radioactive mineral that Sivana calls Sivanium. This is the second form of Sivanium that we've seen in the Golden Age. The last time it was seen was Captain Marvel Adventures number 100, actually. But here in number 150, it's this isotope of Sivanium that Sivana's after, because he's found that he can use it to power a special machine that will mutate all those around him into duplicates of himself, physical and mental. He turns their heads into Sivana heads and their brains into Sivana brains. So this is the way he's planning to conquer the world. In fact, now here's the most troubling wrinkle to me anyway. I've mentioned a couple of times in this episode already that it's a hard fact of Captain Marvel comics that nothing can either harm or alter any member of the Marvel family in any way. But in this story, Sivana finds a way to reroute the SHAZAM lightning that turns Billy into Captain Marvel through the Sivanium, And thereby he is able to affect Captain Marvel and actually mutate him into a Savannah-headed Captain Marvel who is sympathetic to Dr. Savannah's aims and goes out and conquers chunks of the world for him immediately. Of course, this then backfires on Dr. Savannah when the Savannah-brained Captain Marvel decides that he doesn't need the real Dr. Savannah and can just conquer the world on his own. So Dr. Savannah is reduced to going to the Rock of Eternity and begging for SHAZAM's help to destroy this monster of his own making. So that SHAZAM reverts Billy to Captain Marvel, the Savannah-headed Captain Marvel, to Billy. And Billy then actually, another unusual, unconventional feature of this story, he calls on the SHAZAM elders, Solomon, Hercules, etc., to come down and destroy Savannah's machinery for him, since he can't risk turning into Captain Marvel and do it himself, lest he turn back into the Savannah-headed Captain Marvel. So that's a couple of things that have not happened very often in the Golden Age that happen in this final issue. The SHAZAM gods take a direct hand, and Captain Marvel is successfully mutated into something else by Dr. Savannah. One would assume that if the Captain Marvel comics of Fawcett had continued a little further into the 50s, we would have seen this happen more and more often, since that seems to be the vogue for superhero stories at other companies. They become harder for their young audience to take seriously, so the publishers respond by finding humorous ways to alter those characters in humiliating ways. All those red kryptonite stories of Superman, for example, and Batman's rainbow costume and his zebra-striped costume, etc. We probably would have seen more Savanium stories changing Captain Marvel in bizarre and grotesque ways. But as it is, Captain Marvel ends up, with a little help from the SHAZAM elders, putting Savannah's last scheme of the Golden Age on ice. And the last image we see of Dr. Savannah in the 1950s is the final panel of him lying there on the ground at Captain Marvel's feet, utterly defeated, uttering the word curses, 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 as it decrescendos into silence. And that is the swan song of Dr. Savannah. There are only two more Captain Marvel comics of the Atomic Age to address here. The final two issues of the Marvel Family series, because this is we see Fawcett's line of comics undergoing the same gradual contraction and implosion that we've seen happen with other dying lines over the decades. It's kind of collapsed down into one single title with all the Marvel Family characters in it at once. For 2 issues it went on that way, and then silence. So, November 1953, Marvel Family number 88. The Marvel Family go through some growing pains as they try to adjust to sharing living quarters in Mrs. Wagner's boarding house. A prank war breaks out between Freddie Freeman, Cap Jr., and one of their fellow boarders, a traveling salesman named Leroy Marks. I mentioned that Freddie had his own ready-made supporting cast that lived in this boarding house with him. There was Leroy Marks, there was Professor Edgewise, there's a gas station owner named Red O'Reilly, who's a hot-tempered Irish-American, and police officer Jim Bellows. So these would have been the supporting cast for the Marvel Family if they'd gone on in comics a little longer. So a prank war breaks out between Leroy and Freddie, and it nearly turns lethal, and Billy and Mary don't believe Freddie when he tells them that he's not responsible for these pranks. And so after all they've been through together, it takes a prank war at the boarding house to nearly bring the Marvel Family to Splitsville. And this is one of very few times in the Golden Age where you actually see the Marvel Family disagreeing with one another, like a real family, which of course would become a mainstay of Marvel Comics' first family, the Fantastic Four, in the ensuing decade. This is the closest thing we see to the Marvel Family actually breaking up. It turns out that the deadly pranks were actually being perpetrated by an enemy spy who was trying to either kill or at least drive one of the boarders in Mrs. Wagner's boarding house away, because it's in a perfect location for him to pass on secrets to his foreign contacts. So that's how the prank war is resolved, and the Marvel Family's little internal quarrel is sewed up seamlessly. And the rest of that issue features the Marvel Family traveling through time and space, trying to vanquish a villain known as Zotan, who is very much like Marvel Comics' Kang the Conqueror would eventually be. He comes from a future time where war has been abolished. He's banished into the past for his attempts at resurrecting crime and war in the year 1 million AD. And he then uses 20th century technology to recreate the fantastic innovations of the future, including time travel, and he then goes on a quest to conquer the planet Earth in all of its time eras. And he actually succeeds using what he calls mental ammunition, which is basically mind control technology. But the Marvel family finally do get the upper hand on him. They create positive mental ammunition to free his brainwashed troops, and they get the better of him. So there's your last really big, widescreen Marvel family story of the Golden Age. Now, the very last Captain Marvel story of the Atomic Age, Marvel Family number 89. 1 month passed without any Marvel Family content at all, December of 1953. But cover dated January 1954, the last issue, a very iconic cover. It shows the sort of blank outlines of the bodies of Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel. And there's a little boy standing by saying, "Holy moly, what happened to the Marvel family?" And a caption below reads, "Read, and then there were none." It's a perfect visual metaphor for the vanishing Fawcett superheroes. And in the main story in this issue, one by one, all the boarders in Mrs. Wagner's boarding house, even Mary and Freddie, are replaced by evil robot duplicates. And Billy alone has to go in and save the day before he too is replaced. And it turns out that the robots were created by absent-minded old Professor Edgewise, who is somehow being controlled by an evil janitor at the college where he lectures to produce these things. And the story doesn't make a lot of sense, but what the heck, the line was dying anyway. So that, and I guess there is a certain ironic appropriateness to, given the accusations of imitation and plagiarism that Captain Marvel had suffered throughout the Golden Age, that this story about cheap robot duplicates trying to take his place be the last story published of him in his first era in comics. So, and that brings us to the unhappy duty of reporting on the details of the dissolution of the Fawcett Comics line. Now, as we had talked about earlier in this episode and in earlier episodes in this series, the first time National Periodical Publications filed suit against Fawcett was all the way back in 1941. And there had been a long period of the presentation of evidence and just of all kinds of pretrial nonsense. The case never officially came to trial until 1948, fairly late in the Golden Age. And during that time, there were all kinds of thrusts and parries between the legal departments of the two respective publishers. DC would come up with just sheafs and reams of evidence or purported evidence of Captain Marvel doing things in his comic stories that were ripped off from Superman stories. And meanwhile, the Fawcett team, Will Lieberson, the executive editor, reported years later that every available hand in the editorial staff had to devote a significant part of his or her time to doing counter research to indicate that each and every one of these examples DC provided actually was something that had been done prior to Superman doing it by some other character. They went back as far as early comic strips of the first decade of the 20th century, like 1904, to find evidence.
And let's think about how painstaking that would be. This is long before the computers are available to anybody. So they're going through literally the back matter. That must have been exhaustive work.
Yeah, this is physical archival research, and it's a miracle they were still able to get their comics put out because all the editors had to help with it. And one editor, Henry Perkins by name, was actually assigned. He didn't have the most creative mind, apparently, according to some of his colleagues. So he was put in charge. It was on permanent archival research detail. But so after years of this, the case finally came to question in 1948. Fawcett actually gained the first decision. DC appealed, and Fawcett won the second decision. But finally, in 1953, and those close to the case recalled that the killing blow that finally earned DC the third decision in this ongoing legal battle was that there was one particular Captain Marvel comic that contained one panel that had demonstrably been copied from a panel in a Superman story. I don't know which issue it was or what panel it was or who drew it. I mean, that's not in any of my sources, but apparently it did happen. And that was what caused the court to find in favor of National. Now, years later, a couple of different sources, including Roscoe Fawcett, one of the Fawcett brothers, who were the owners and the chief officers of the Fawcett Company, declared that they probably could have tried one more appeal. The legal battle did not have to end at that point. But so Roscoe Fawcett opined, if they had won that battle, it probably would have been the final definitive victory. But if they had lost it, there was a chance that DC in the counter-settlement would have ended up with the entire assets of the company. They basically would have owned Fawcett outright. So rather than take that chance, Fawcett was... It should be stressed that it wasn't just the legal battle that put an end to Fawcett's role as a comic book publisher. The Fawcett family was never that interested in comic books in the first place. They just joined the superhero gold rush back at the end of the 40s, the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s. They were strictly in it for the money. Some of the people they hired, including Otto Binder and editor Wendell Crowley, had a real, genuine love for the medium and for the stories that could be produced therein. But the money people upstairs didn't look at it that way. And their profits had been in decline steadily, as we said earlier in this episode, from the peak money days in 1946 all the way down through the 50s. Their sales had been in pretty steady decline. The comics were still turning a profit, but the Fawcetts felt it was about time to cut their losses anyway. So there is a chance that Fawcett and the Captain Marvel comics would have gone on a little later than the end of 1953. If not for the litigiousness of DC National. But they probably would have pulled the plug on the comics line a couple of years later anyway. All DC really did was make the decision easier for them to make.
So in other words, Murd, Fawcett, as long as Captain Marvel was profitable, Fawcett was committed to that legal fight. But once that profitability began to wane, they just decided to give up the ghost then.
Yes, exactly. So they just decided to let DC have their little way. They decided to settle out of court with DC National. They tendered to them the amount of $400,000. And in addition to that, although they retained their rights to all of their superhero characters, including Captain Marvel and the Marvel family, they promised never to publish any comics featuring those characters again. And while they were at it, they decided just not to publish any more comics again. They sold much of the remainder of their titles and licenses, and a couple of their characters even, to Charlton Comics. And so it was that Fawcett did have a kind of a life after death in comics, even a few years after 1953. Charlton continued to publish funny animals, including some new and reprinted stories of Hoppy the Marvel Bunny. Although, to avoid being in violation of Fawcett's agreement with DC National, they did have to change Hoppy's coloration and name from Hoppy the Marvel Bunny to Hoppy the Magic Bunny, and change his magic word from Shazam to Alazam. So, of all creatures, Hoppy he was the last member of the Marvel family to continue hopping along in comics after the demise of the Fawcett line.
And we have to remind people, Murd, that the whole reason this lawsuit went on as it did is because DC felt completely threatened by Captain Marvel's success. I mean, I don't remember the exact year, but at one point in the Golden Age, Captain Marvel was outselling Superman titles. So he was I mean, we talked about already he had his own movie serial. He was enormously popular.
He was a sales juggernaut without a doubt. But, of course, those days were already behind him as we got to 1953. So, again, just for the sake of allowing Fawcett to save some face in the annals of history, let it be said that it wasn't so much that they were definitively defeated as that they decided to accept definitive defeat at that point. So they shut down their entire comics line. They did offer jobs elsewhere in the Fawcett's publication empire, their magazine line, for example, to some of their editors. But a lot of writers and artists suddenly found themselves out of work, and a few of them, C.C. Beck included, never quite forgave Fawcett for that. Some of them landed on their feet elsewhere. There was one editor named Ed France Heron, for example, who was one of those who actually turned evidence against Fawcett in the DC inquests. And he ended up being a prominent writer and editor at DC, and he contributed some things to their Silver Age line of comics. And even Otto Binder, one of those who was the most hurt and saddened by the end of Captain Marvel in 1953, he ended up working for DC in the end, and made a lot of meaningful contributions to their Superman line, and came to love the Big Blue Boy Scout only a little bit less than he had loved the Big Red Cheese. So there are a couple of happy endings to be had here, but the one that most concerns us here in these SHAZAM spotlights is the less happy ending. Captain Marvel and his friends, allies, and enemies all were sealed up in that suspendium globe of history and shunted into limbo for 20 long years.
Well, we have to note that, and of course this will be addressed in future episodes, that ironically Captain Marvel will find new life under the auspices of DC.
Mm-hmm. The very evil force, well, I don't know, that's probably a little bit yellow of me to say that, but the very force that consigned them to that limbo in the first place. Yep, that is one of comics history's greater ironies. I think we can agree.
Brother, this was masterfully done. Bravo, sir.
Chris, it was made all the more so by your interjections and your historical sidebar about the Korean War, which I absolutely could not have supplied, and which definitely enriched this historical symposium. So I thank you very much for that.
My comrade in arms, I'm honored. You're quite welcome.
All right, so that brings this spotlight on SHAZAM in the Atomic Age to a close. Rest assured, at some future time, we will be returning with SHAZAM in the Bronze Age, where we learned something about the second life of Captain Marvel at his new home at DC National in the future. But for now, our long Golden Age journey has finally come to a close. And Chris, I thank you again for accompanying me on said journey.
Thank you, sir.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can send it to comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail, you can call 267-702-6642. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @comicgeekspeak. You can visit thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com, our brand new URL for our web presence, where you can leave feedback for this episode of Comic Geek Speak and many, many, many others we've recorded over the years. And while you're there, participate in some comics-related or otherwise geeky discussions with your fellow CGS listeners and friends that may not be directly related to our podcast. But certainly, I'm always happy to hear your thoughts about these series of spotlights. Let me know what thoughts you may have on Captain Marvel in the 1950s. You can also visit the digitalcomicsmuseum.com, where you can do what I did and undertake the reading of all the many and varied stories of the Big Red Cheese published by Fawcett back in the 40s and 50s, and also all the other comics they published. It's really a wealth of comics reading pleasure, and I encourage you all to check it out. We'd like to thank everyone who's donated monetarily to the podcast, either recently or in the distant past. We really appreciate it, and the show would not be what it is today without your help. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time.
Laser beams, opinions like the sea.